We are still allowed all the many participants. There are more than 400 people that have registered for our meeting, so we are very, very pleased with the results, of the interest that we have raised with after the first January meeting on the Within Judaism perspective. So we have three very, very dense and I hope full of lively discussion days ahead. The first day will be devoted to a session on Paul within Judaism. The second will focus on the Gospel of Mark. The third day will be dealing with the book of Revelation. In the meeting in January, we began a discussion about the theoretical principles of this new perspective on the study of the New Testament. Of course, for centuries, Christianity was presented against Judaism. So as a replacement, as a new revelation that superseded the old one. So no relation was possible between Christianity and Judaism. Gradually, starting already in the 17th century, scholars began realizing that knowing Judaism of the first century, and in general Second Temple Jewish sources, were very useful in order to understand the content of the New Testament. This did not immediately translate in a more appreciative way of understanding Judaism, but certainly scholars became more and more aware of the connections between Christianity and Judaism. In particular, the real watershed was after World War II, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, also the post-Holocaust period that reshaped the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. So it became very, very important to rediscover the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. So from an understanding of Christianity against Judaism, there was a relationship of a new relationship in which instead a relationship was understood. In recent years, with the development of a within Judaism perspective, we want to go a step further. The idea not only that Christianity should be understood, of the documents in the New Testament should be understood in light of Second Temple Judaism, but we are now saying that the Christian text in the New Testament are part of the diverse world of Second Temple Judaism, so they are Jewish texts later collected into a Christian canon. Of course, this new perspective has opened a lot of questions, and we want to address some of these questions in our conference in these days and later on in September. To say that the New Testament texts are Jewish texts that are part of Second Temple Judaism is something that includes all documents of the New Testament, or should we make a distinction between some text in the New Testament that should be read within Judaism and some of them that instead should no longer be read within Judaism? And even if all documents in the New Testament are within Judaism, should be read within Judaism, what is the moment or are the criteria that makes a test no longer within Judaism. So as we have seen in the very live discussion we have in January, every time we try to solve the problem, we have to say, okay, let's treat this test as New Testament, as a Jewish test. We open a very large number of questions. The Enoch seminar is an open forum that wants to give everybody the possibility of an open and free discussion with no limitations. So we are not bound to a particular understanding of the problem or a particular understanding of this perspective. We are very, very pleased that so many people are joining our group from all over the world. I repeat, we have more than 400 registered participants to these meetings, and they come really from everywhere. Specialists in New Testament and specialists in Second Temple Judaism. Today we will start with an introduction by Isaac Oliver, who has been the main organizer of this conference, and he will give us a 15-minute introduction clarifying the scope, the purposes, the questions that we want to address during these 3 days. We will have then the first 3-hour session on Paul within Judaism with a group of panelists. We invite all of you to join us using, first of all, the chat with questions, comments, because the discussion will not be limited only to the people that appear on the screen. So please let us know that you want to take part in the discussion, first of all, through the chat and asking briefly some comments or putting questions, and we'll be very pleased to make you part on this discussion. We want to hear as many voices as possible. Tomorrow morning we will start at 9:30 again with a 30 minutes of informal discussion about the results of the previous day. Tomorrow morning, Paula Fredrickson will be with us, leading with us this informal discussion with other people that have attended the first day of the conference. A similar thing we'll do the next day with Jim McGrath and other friends and participants that have been protagonists of the second day of the conference. Again, welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us. Thank you to the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies that has supported our initiative. Thanks again to Isaac Oliver. Thank you to Megan Wines, that is our secretary and is taking care of everything so well. Isaac, it's your turn.
Thank you, Gabriele. Greetings to everyone from the mighty metropolis of Peoria. It's good to have you. I'd point out that we are also live on YouTube, and you should be able to find the link on Facebook if you access that social media to see that live or to share that with friends and colleagues. So I'd like to share a few introductory words about the purpose of our conference. It'll overlap a little bit with what Gabriele has just said here, which will focus on the following questions. Should a given text from the New Testament or early Christianity be considered part of Judaism? What criteria determine whether an early Christian text is or is not within Judaism? And what changes when said text is read within Judaism? Before we're going to roll up our sleeves today and discuss these questions in greater detail, we might wonder about the very genesis of these questions that give this conference its raison d'être. How did we get here? Why these questions? What forces, human and superhuman, earthly and cosmic, fleshly and pneumatic, led to the creation of this conference? The immediate answer is simple. Gabriele alluded to the virtual conference colloquium, actually, that was held on January the 7th in 2025 by yours truly, the Enoch Seminar. That antecedent event, in turn, was partly inspired by the recent publication of the volume edited by Karen Zetterholm and Anders Runeson called Within Judaism, Interpretive Trajectories in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam from the 1st to the 21st century. This volume charts the shifting boundaries of Judaism from antiquity to the modern period in order to bring clarity to what scholars mean when they claim that ancient texts or groups are within Judaism. I should mention en passant that the Enoch Seminar will host a book panel later this month on this volume at the International Meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature. Already during the preparation for and in the aftermath of the online colloquium held on January the 7th, there was much talk about organizing a much larger event to discuss various early Christian documents, both canonical and non-canonical, concerning the nomenclature within Judaism. The nomenclature within Judaism really made its grand debut on the cover of the 2015 volume Paul Within Judaism, Restoring the First Century Context to the Apostle, edited by Mark Nanos and Magnus Zederholm, which was paralleled by the publication of Paul the Jew, Rereading the Apostle as a Figure of Second Temple Judaism, edited by Gabriele Boccaccini and Carlo Segovia. Since then, the nomenclature within Judaism has spread to other subfields of early Christian and New Testament studies, notably Matthean studies, with a volume bearing the title Matthew Within Judaism, appearing in 2020, edited again by Anders Rudison and Daniel Gertner. And John Campian's monograph, Matthew Within Sectarian Judaism, which came out in 2019. Bisiata di Shamaya, the volume Luke and Acts Within Second Temple Judaism, edited by Isaac Oliver, Jocelyn McWhirter, and Joshua Scott, will be unveiled later this year or the beginning of 2026 of the Common Era. On the Johannine front, Wally Sirafezi has penned a monograph titled John Within Judaism, Religion, Ethnicity, and the Shaping of Jesus-Oriented Jewishness in the Fourth Gospel. And before that came John Reynolds and Deborah Forger's Reading the Gospel of John's Christology as Jewish Messianism. In Markan studies, John von Maren's monograph, The Gospel of Mark's Judaism and the Death of Christ as Ransom for Many, is fresh off the press. In fact, an insightful and helpful article written by John von Maren was published in 2023 in the journal Zeitschrift für die Neutestamentliche Wissenschaft, ZNW, that is very much apropos for the purposes of our conference. I want to interact a bit with this piece titled, How Can the New Testament Writings Be Within Judaism? Distinguishing Ways of Asking and Answering the Question. This article critically evaluates the meanings of within Judaism and related phrases when applied to the texts now collected in the New Testament. To distinguish more clearly how the early Christian texts may or may not be expressions of first century Judaism, von Maren proposes a methodology and terminology that is informed by recent developments in the sociology of groups and their boundaries. To this end, von Maren first considers the meaning behind saying that text X or text Y is within Judaism. For instance, to state that Matthew is within Judaism requires clarifying at least 3 points. What is meant by Matthew? What is Judaism? And finally, what would it mean for Matthew to be within Judaism? As von Maren points out, within Matthean studies, there is a close correlation posited between the identities of the author of the first gospel and its intended audience, the so-called Matthean group or Matthean community. Most Matthean scholars believe that both the author and the intended audience were Jewish. However, this supposition cannot apply to Paul and his audience in the same way, as it is widely accepted that Paul wrote primarily to Gentiles. Thus, the phrase Paul within Judaism would apply more to Paul's Jewishness than to his Gentile acolytes. Indeed, scholars of the so-called Paul within Judaism perspective stress that Paul remained a Jew and continued to practice Judaism throughout his career as an apostolos ton ethnon. Others, on the other hand, have not defended so much the Jewishness of the author or the targeted audience of an early Christian text, but the Jewishness of the discourses or ideas and practices endorsed in these documents. For example, Wally Sirafezi investigates how the Gospel of John's compositional strategies shape a type of Jewish identity. I adopted a similar approach in my first monograph, now in second printing, Torah Praxis after 70 CE, arguing that both Matthew and Luke Acts are Jewish texts in the sense that they support the observance of key markers of Jewish identity, such as the Sabbath, dietary laws, and circumcision among Jews, while only expecting Gentiles to adhere to a subset of Jewish practices, the apostolic decree, as it is traditionally called. Ethnically discriminating between laws that apply only to Jews and laws that also concern Gentiles is common to early Judaism, as evidenced, for example, by the classical rabbinic notion of the Noahide laws. It is in this legal sense, which distinguishes halachic expectations based on one's ethnicity, that Matthew and Luke Acts prove to be just as Jewish as any other early Jewish text. As von Maren rightly observes, the decision of whether to focus on the relationship of the text, the author, or some other social grouping to first century Judaism is partly determined by the available evidence. There is much more data for evaluating Paul's self-identity and even the identity of his audience than, say, Matthew, which is an anonymous text written in narrative form. But what do we mean by Judaism when we speak of something or someone being within Judaism? Some participating in this conference might object to using the word Judaism tout court. I think of Daniel Boyarin, who eschews its usage for pre-modern Jewish history, preferring instead terms such as Jewishness or Judaïté, given that the word Judaism has long been the victim of distortion and abstraction, reducing Jewishness to a religion created in the image of Christianity as a set of practices and beliefs, minus the confession of Jesus, of course. Others still might find it more promising to explore how early Christian documents define and relate to the concept of Israel. During the Second Temple period, the term Jew or Judean was a subcategory of the broader term Israel or Israelite, as Jason Staples convincingly demonstrates in his book, The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism. In answering the question, what is Judaism? Von Maren focuses on ancient Jews as an ethnic group rather than on Judaism understood as a cultural or religious system of practices and beliefs. The reasons are manifold. Jews, after all, are presented as an ethnos in the ancient sources that survive history, alongside other ancient groups such as Romans, Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, and so forth. Following the widely referenced work of John Hutchinson and Anthony D. Smith, von Maren adopts a polythetic definition of ethnicity, which singles out several traits that are typical of ethnic groups, such as having a common proper name, a myth of a common ancestry, shared memories of a common past, elements of a common culture, a link to a common homeland, and a shared sense of solidarity. As von Maren observes, a polythetic definition of Jewish identity or nationality allows for an exploration of the relationship between early Jewish followers of Jesus and their Judaïté in interesting and broad ways. Developed by sociologists and anthropologists of ethnicity also enables one to analyze group identification in a value-neutral way, since ethnicity is primarily a matter of perception involving individual self-perception and how others classify them. Coming back to the phrase within Judaism, if we think of the preposition within on a social plane and Judaism as a cultural production of the Jewish people, then we can follow von Maren's suggestion that, quote, a Christ adherent or Christ group would be within Judaism only if their self-identification corresponded with how other Jews classify them. That is, if there is mutual recognition that they are part of the Jewish ethnic group, and if they behave in ways that would communicate to Jews and non-Jews that they are Jewish, end of quote. Unfortunately, we don't have Jewish documents from the first century that would tell us how non-Jesus believing Jews would have related to or perceived the Jewishness of the early Jesus movement. I also think of modern-day examples that complicate the picture, such as Reform Jews, whose Jewishness is often denied by ultra-Orthodox Judaism, especially converts to Reform Judaism, who nevertheless see themselves and are seen by others as being Jews. At any rate, we are left with critically assessing how Jesus's early Jewish followers self-identified. In his examination of the New Testament writings, von Maren makes an interesting suggestion. I quote him again. I suggest using the phrase, e.g., Paul or Matthew's Judaism, for a New Testament text whose most privileged in-group is made of Jews. That is, a text that retains the distinction between the Jews and the nations, and that understands the Jews to have some privilege in comparison to the nations, even among Christ followers. End of quote. Several scholars of the Paul within Judaism Schule have made precisely these points with regard to Paul, arguing that Paul does not completely erase Jewish difference and even maintains that Jews enjoy some kind of privileged position guaranteed by their covenantal election. Interestingly, a growing number of scholarly publications make such claims about works that were previously thought to dismiss or cancel Jewish praxis. In addition to the aforementioned works on Luke Acts, Paul Sloan, one of today's panelists, offers compelling arguments in his new book, Jesus and the Law of Moses, regarding Jesus' observance of the Torah as depicted in all three synoptic gospels. Other works could be referenced. Of course, these recent developments stem from particular interpretations that will have to be submitted to the judge of history to determine whether they will gain permanent traction. Nevertheless, a recent volume called Paul Within Judaism, Perspectives on Paul and Jewish Identity, edited by Michael Bird, Ruben Bühner, Jörg Frey, and Brian Rosner, may give us an idea of the questions and debates that lie ahead for our conference and beyond. In the introduction to this volume, Michael Bird offers a preliminary critique of the Paul Within Judaism perspective. First, Bird observes that Paul Within Judaism scholars are freshly probing the meaning of Judaios and Judaismos. This raises questions about the nature and diversity of Judaism in the first century. To what extent do we follow E.P. Sanders' notion of common Judaism, which emphasizes what Jews held in common, versus the idea of multiple Judaisms advanced by the likes of Jakub Neusner? If we agree with the latter, then Paul's Jewishness needs an adjective, says Bird. In other words, we're going to have to ask, what kind of Jew was Paul, or Mark, or Matthew? Second, Bird remarks that Paul Within Judaism scholars take it as axiomatic that Paul himself was Torah observant and strenuously rejected the imposition of most of the Torah commandments, especially circumcision, upon Gentiles. Nevertheless, Bird finds that Paul Within Judaism advocates have tended to downplay the negative reception that Paul received from other Jews in the diaspora and in Judea. For instance, why did Paul receive 5 times the 40-1 lashes from local Jewish authorities? Was it blasphemy? Was it because he was perceived as a lawbreaker? Was it because of Paul's claim that Gentiles were in some way Israel, or at least heirs of the promises made to Abraham? Indeed, Bird identifies the identity of the Gentiles in Christ as the third item with which Paul Within Judaism scholars have wrestled. Bird claims that Paul Within Judaism scholars are generally averse to identifying the Pauline Gentile majority assemblies of Christ believers as incorporated into Israel as true Jews or even as a third race. This supposed allergy to equating Gentiles with Israel ties in with a fourth concern of Paul Within Judaism scholars that Bird highlights: anti-supersessionism. Indeed, according to Bird, the Paul Within Judaism can even be called an anti-supersessionist project. I will leave it to others present here to discuss and to judge to what extent anti-supersessionism is integral to the Paul Within Judaism project. Undoubtedly, this concern is true for some of its advocates, but perhaps not for others who would rather distance themselves from contemporary affairs, whether theological or political. Still, the matter of supersessionism reminds us of the ethical implications of our research, especially for those who are invested in pursuing interreligious or intercultural dialogue, but even for those of us who are seemingly uninterested in such matters. If a higher proportion of people have registered for this Enoch seminar event, I take that as a sign of its academic and popular relevance. Therefore, we might wonder how there can be such an unprecedented explosion of investigations reclaiming the Jewishness of first-century Christian texts, while these same texts have produced or have been used to produce anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, Judeophobia, whatever word suits you best. I'm thinking, for example, of the new volume, Judeophobia, and the New Testament, edited by Sarah Rollins, Aaron Van den Eyck, and Meredith Warren. How can a text be within Judaism, yet produce anti-Judaism? This is a question that we might address during our discussions when the opportunity arises. Due to its scope, this conference might prove to be the mother of all conferences on reading the New Testament within Judaism. It has accordingly been divided into two parts. The first half takes place today, tomorrow, and Thursday, and includes panels dedicated to Paul, Mark, and Revelation. The second half is scheduled from September 15 to 17 and will feature panels on Matthew, Luke, Acts, John, Hebrews, James, and non-canonical works contemporaneous with New Testament writings, such as 1 Clement, Barnabas, the Proto-Evangelion of James, and the writings of Justin Martyr. The title of this conference, Reading Paul Within Judaism, is intentionally formulated with a question mark. We have done so to welcome a diversity of viewpoints and encourage our participants to experiment with new and old wine. Better if it is French or Italian. Even a little bit of Brazilian caipirinha might help. We hope that no one will feel constrained by the questions formulated for the conference. Hence, the question still remains open whether Plony or such and such a text should be cataloged under the rubric within Judaism, since we want to encourage this conference to work as a workshop that animates open, dynamic discussions. Some might object to the very nomenclature or the formulation of the questions. That's fine. The Enoch seminar can handle a good machloket, as long as we promise not to excommunicate anyone for claiming that the oven of Achnai is kosher or not kosher. We begin naturally so with a panel on Paul within Judaism. Mark Nanos will start the session, followed by Crispin Fletcher Lewis. We will continue in the order listed in the program, which is available on the Enoch Seminar webpage dedicated to this conference. Panelists of the Paul session, you have been granted 8 to 10 minutes to address the conference questions in your preferred manner. Presentations may be formal or informal. Feel free, if you wish, to respond to preceding comments during a presentation. You may improvise, play some jazz. Bossa Nova is even better. Alternatively, you can stick to the script and read from the teleprompter, whatever fancies you. However, at around the 8th minute, you will hear a bell ring. This was used in the Francophone Enoch seminar to tell you have 2 minutes left. After each panelist has made their presentation, we will probably take a short break. Then the floor will be open to allow the panelists and other participants to interact with one another. We're going to, in fact, now allow the Paul panelists to log in onto the screen, and then we will begin promptly with our discussion on Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, Isaac, very much for this introduction. Again, I would like, while the panelists of the Paul within Judaism sessions are introduced, I would like to take advantage of these few minutes to, once again, to welcome all of you. I mean, all the many participants that have joined this webinar. Really, we have a very large number of people that is attending this presentation. So welcome again on behalf of the entire Enoch seminar. I would like to remind all the people in attendance that this conference, as all the events of the Enoch seminar online, is offered free of charge, but a donation is very much welcome to cover expenses. And also, I would like to invite all of you to consider the opportunity to join our community, becoming a member of the Enoch seminar with a annual contribution, which is as much as you like. We are a small, big organization that counts only on the generosity and the commitment of its members, also from the financial point of view. And so we are asking all of you that are contributing to this conference and attending this conference to support our activities and to give us even a small sign of your support and appreciation. Is not only appreciated, but is needed. Thank you very much. And I'm giving the word to Isaac again, that will be chairing this first session on Paul within Judaism.
Excellent, great. Well, the list of the panelists is available on the Enoch Seminar webpage. I provided the link here. Mark Nanos will begin first with a keynote address, followed by Christopher Fletcher Lewis, and then I'll just follow the order that is listed. Mark Nanos, the floor is with you. As they say in the Hunger Games, may the odds always be with you.
Thank you. We're good now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm grateful to be part of this event, and I can only make a few brief comments, of course. In recent years, important essays, as Isaac has just listed, have discussed issues central to undertaking research from within Judaism, and mostly a Paul within Judaism perspective. And they've addressed many of the conference topics. So I don't think I can even offer even a summary of a summary in the few minutes that are allotted. I do want to make a very brief comment that I understand the reluctance of some people to use within Judaism. And I understand the need to put some distance. I get that. In fact, you know, as is common refrain, I've always been a little bit reluctant to be a part of any group that would have me. And I think it's a mistake to focus too much on the title itself. The title is there to be used to do the kind of work we want to do. And its real benefit, and I think it is a benefit, is that it strikes right at the heart of what has occupied most New Testament scholarship. That is that what people are reading, the billion Christians in the world pretty much think what they're reading is something Christian and very much not Jewish or Judaism, something that left it behind, and to the extent that Jews or Israel are used, they're used to refer to Christians as the true or the spiritual or the real or the refound or so on like this. And but to really talk about Jewish identity and Jewish behavior as described in the Pentateuch or the Torah, elsewhere in the Tanakh and Jewish traditions, is not something that most people have approached Paul's language from, not only with respect to Paul himself, but with respect to what those who had to decode his messages originally, his target addressees, as I prefer to use it, what they thought they were reading, the person from whom they thought these messages came, as one who had left and who renounced it, or at least disregarded it as appropriate, and thought that it was actually harmful to them. It weakened their faith, in usual terminology. So the simple place to begin, in my view, to read within Judaism, or to test readings of Judaism, or even to refuse readings of Judaism, is to begin by constructing hypotheses around the idea that Paul's texts represent the views of one who practiced and promoted a Jewish way of life, which is what I mean by within Judaism. This involves positioning Paul and his addressees within Jewish subgroups, in my arguments, also synagogue subgroups. Now, these are not necessarily common to within Judaism scholarship, and they shouldn't be broadly applied to anyone who doesn't want them applied to them. But in my case, I've argued that way long before the moniker within Judaism was ever invented, which we really invented to have a title for a book and a conference, and the SBL conferences in the early teens. And even though some of us may have used within Judaism, I like to refer to Paul's Judaism as I got a little bolder over the aughts. But I just mean it's Jewish stuff. That's what Paul writes about, and so on. To me, it's just as important to think about what his target addressees would interpret. Would they interpret Paul as one who practices a Jewish way of life and promotes a Jewish way of life, not just for himself and fellow Jews, but for the non-Jews who had turned to Jesus as the Messiah, a very Jewish decision. And did they see themselves as being enculturated into Jewishness? Jewishish non-Jews, perhaps, is a way to refer to this. I think so. And that's the hypothesis I think that should be tested. And for those who want to contest it, that's the hypothesis and the premises involved in that hypothesis to which they should push back. And I think one of the big problems in this discussion, especially by those, for example, in some essays in the Bird conference volume and others, is they change the premises to their own premises. But you can't really test a hypothesis and have a useful conversation going forward unless you accept the premises of the ones who are advancing something new and interact with those. And I have to say, one of my biggest disappointments with the challenges is not the challenge. We want the challenge because we want to do as good a work as we can. And it will, the name itself will change. It'll be a better name, I'm sure, and better hypotheses and better ways of testing them. But in the meantime, misrepresentation is not helpful. It's just a way of shutting down the process. So I hope we can avoid that as much as possible here and deal with what people actually argue. I think if we do these hypotheses and test them, we'll find things are different than what people thought before. Will they be as different as I think they are? I don't know. I have, my suggestion for the few minutes I have is to kind of just remind you that I've tried to do this in a very inductive way, engaging in the process of the way that Pauline scholarship has worked, which is by doing exegetical work. That is, going into these texts and asking of them these kinds of questions, which requires us to think about new translation alternatives, not just interpretive alternatives. And one of the biggest problems within Judaism scholarship, certainly for Paul, I can say, but I suspect for all the others, is that until we change the translations to mirror the kind of hypotheses that we're dealing with, or at least to be open to looking at the language itself, instead of just quoting, for example, in English and in my native language, instead of just quoting something that seems to say Paul thinks the law is over, or that it leads to sin, or that he's dead to it, or anything else. Really, we need to look at the texts themselves, each one, and ask if that's the best translation, because translations incorporate interpretations, and we know those interpretations that we have are not based on interpreters who thought Paul was doing something Jewish anymore. And I think that's a key thing moving forward, as I've talked about before. So, for example, and I think it's an important one, and I'm sure all of you will agree, in Galatians chapter 1, Paul uses language that betrays a very Jewish thinker, not just a Jewish thinker, but a Pharisee, some kind of subgroup of Pharisees. He doesn't refer to the traditions of the fathers, my former traditions of the fathers, but the traditions of my fathers. Why would he still be doing that? I think that betrays his social location, the way he self-identifies. When he, as it's normally translated, that he left Judaism, his former way, I think when we talk about his former way of practicing Judaism, his Jewish way of life, it opens up to the fact that Catholics can talk about the kind of Catholic they used to be, or Protestants, or they could go back and forth between the two. And the same with Jews. The way that he practiced it formerly had changed with whatever it is he's trying to describe. And what he actually focuses on describing is that he now goes to the nations with a different message, which does seem to imply to me that Paul was already going to the nations, but with a message that was different. What's the difference? Well, again, I think it's betrayed both by his language of he didn't go not just to the apostles, but to flesh and blood, which are usually conflated. But I think that's another circumlocution for a Pharisaic subgroup to which he didn't offer his revelation for approval. And I suspect, I wouldn't argue too hard for it, but I suspect that it's some sort of proto-rabbinic idea that your peers matter. Sort of the oven thing to which Oliver referred to is the decision-making about what God wants up to the majority of the peers. Paul does not subject his revelation to that. I also think 5:10, where he refers to if he still proclaimed circumcision, that is proselyte transformation for these non-Jews, which implies, I think, that he did before this revelation, that he was already involved in trying to bring non-Jews into the people, but he did so by trying to make them part of the people of Israel or Jews in some proselyte-oriented manner. And he doesn't do that anymore. And that's why his position and the position of this group is contested. I suspect it's why he contested it before. By the way, I think that's better than persecuted from the Oko group, as Heidi Wendt has argued. I think she's right, and I've been using that now for a few years.
You have to unfortunately wrap up, Mark.
Okay, I'll do so. Other examples that I've done, offered to you, you'll be aware of, but one I've been working on in recent years, it's not had much time out there, is ergonomu. Shouldn't be works of law. It should refer to traditions that have been developing about proselyte circumcision, which are not in Torah. So Paul is not opposing Torah or Jewish behavior. Also, to the Jews as a Jews, I've argued for that. Broken branches and hardened should be calloused and so on in Romans 11. And especially not persuaded rather than disobedient would really make a big difference in how we read that. So in conclusion, I think at the heart of this enterprise is heart. What do any of us want this to do or not to do? Which is central to what any of us choose to do, how we choose to go about doing it, how we react to what we suppose would threaten what we want. We need to be honest about our engagement in or indifference to or effort against within Judaism research. We need to learn from each other how to live in ways that promote well-being, not least for those who are different from us. I believe this endeavor can promote these kind of ideals more than the ones that have come before it. I hope those that come after it will do so all the more. Thank you.
Sorry. Yes, thank you, Mark. We're going to proceed immediately to Crispin Fletcher Lewis. We'll have occasion, of course, later on to speak more and discuss with each other's ideas. But Crispin, you may now proceed. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going straight to a presentation, hopefully. Oh, it's telling me I've got to go to my system preferences. Okay, I'll do that. Hold on. Oh, it's telling me to quit and reopen. Oh, what should I do?
Do you need to share your screen? Is that it?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. Would you like to go to the third person so I can quit and restart? It's telling me I need to quit and restart.
I mean, we can do that. Megan, also, I don't know if you received the PowerPoint. We could have somebody share the PowerPoint, but we can, while we're trying to figure that out, proceed to the next presenter, which is Pierluigi Piovanelli. But I suspect Pierluigi, you also need to share your screen too, because you did just send a PowerPoint beforehand. There we go. Okay, so yours is working. We'll go with Pierluigi and come back to Crispin afterwards.
Your microphone, Pierluigi.
Yes, I see. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, do you see the slides?
Yes, we do.
I like practical cases, so test cases. So my case is a case, it's a passage that I studied a few years ago, and I would like to go back in order to show the complexities of within Judaism and within Christianity at the same time. And I would like to start with a disclaimer because I heard about some critiques against the present-day meeting, critiques against the hidden agendas, perhaps, or supposedly so. So I would like to say that I'm a professional historian myself. What is an historian? Read Carlo Ginzburg if you wish to have more clarification. Second Temple Judaism and Jesus movement, of course. I have no political or religious agenda. At least I don't let my religious or political ideas interfere too much, I hope so, with my research. I don't I'm not the victim of restriction by any institution. I hope so, at least. And I understand that actually within Judaism, the very idea is problematic to some faithful and also to some colleagues, honestly. But I'm sorry, there is nothing I can do about it. If the conclusion of my research goes into that direction, I will stick to that conclusion. So having said that, of course, I've been using and perusing the recent collection of studies published by Karin Zetterholm and Anders Runeson. We have been studying it for 6 months in Paris, and we have analyzed every chapter carefully and criticized at the same time. But it was really, really an interesting experiment because it was useful, it was stimulating. And I would like to add to the quote that I gave you on January the 7th, the quote from Gabriele, I would like to add a new quote about the Jewishness, the Jewish nature of the New Testament. It's the short quote that I translated. It's more than obvious, firstly, that the evangelists were Jews, their style is replete with Aramaism, their turn of mind is all Jewish. Secondly, that all the circumstances surrounding the birth and of the doctrine were imbued with Judaism. Jesus' controversies with the various sects, his legal practices, the halakha, his reaction against Judaism. In a word, the gospel is a picture of Jewish habits at the time. And I would like to ask you who wrote these few lines and when. You are not going to find it online because it was published in a book that is not online in 1921, but actually is Ernest Renan, the young Ernest Renan, in 1845, in an unpublished sketchbook in which he noted some ideas about the origins of Christianity. So historians have known that reality, the Jewishness of New Testament, of early Christianity, well, at least since 1845 and even before, I suppose. So it should not be a surprise, a total surprise. Of course, we are in depth for concerning Paul to Christer Stendhal, to E.P. Sanders, but I am pleased to see that actually from that strand, from that beginning, those beginning 50, 60 years ago, now this research has reached even the shores of Italy, thanks to Gabriele, Giulio, and I would like to mention this beautiful volume, collective volume, Reactivating Paul of Tarsus, to which even some colleagues, Mark Nanos among others, have participated. So it's a wonderful achievement. And by the way, it was the occasion to discover this strange, freaky, to me at least, expressionist, I believe, painter. And I discovered that actually he painted 2 different versions of the same painting with a very inspired and very mystical Paul, isn't it? So my point today would turn around the strange charge against the nations in the first chapters of Romans. I've dealt with it in 2023, so you have the short article, at least we have the pages you can find easily online. And it was a problem that I felt immediately when I read again this passage with my students in Greek, of course, because in the end, at least from the beginning, it was very strange to me that actually the apostle, supposedly in charge of the salvation of the nations, was actually accusing the nations, the pagan nations, of course, of all kind of evils in a very, let's say, very strange way. Here you have the text, isn't it, in the New Revised Standard Version. Paula Friedrichsen just wrote, this is the most Baroque description of of stereotypes against Greek-Roman society. And I agree with her. It's strange. It was strange to me. And if you read my article, you will notice why it was strange to me. And it's a passage that resonates with a lot of Jewish, Second Temple Jewish apologetics against pagans, against the nations, but is strange under the pen of Paul. And finally, my initial feeling was that actually this was not Paul. It's not Paul speaking here, but it's simply, I would say, the second case in the Epistle to the Romans of a prosopopoeia, an impersonification of Paul creating a character, a fictional character, who starts speaking and telling and talking about, proposing ideas that are actually the ideas that are against these ideas Paul is reacting. So an impersonification. And this is clear to me, at least from the beginning of the second chapter, because at that point, clearly, Paul reacts to the speech and treats the speaker of hypocritical. You are without excuse, but anapologetos is the qualifier used for the nations, because you judge others, and when you judge the others, you pass condemnation on yourself. So it's a kind of a discovery, little discovery that actually would go into the direction of what Christer Stendhal in 1960 and 1963 had already mentioned, already identified in chapter 7. So actually, it's not Paul who is speaking here. And I was surprised, I was positively surprised to learn actually that Douglas Campbell, in his monumental book in 2009, had already reached this conclusion, and he had already at least reached some historical conclusion based on that fact. He calls it a Socratic way, rhetorical Socratic way of manipulating the readers into a certain direction. And you have here the summary, because of the Deliverance of God is an enormous book, but you have a useful summary published in the Expository Times. At least you can read if you don't read the, I don't know, 800 pages of the original monograph, you can read the summary by Campbell. My next question was, who could be this teacher, the teacher against whom Paul is reacting? Who could be this teacher who is criticizing so heavily the nations, the so-called pagans, the Gentiles? And I believe that actually the connection should be done with the epistle to the Galatians, because in the second chapter of the epistle to the Galatians, as you know, there is this charge against Peter. Peter is not called Peter with his Greek nickname, but with his Aramaic nickname, Kephas, and he is the one who is accused of being hypocritical, exactly for the same problems, because because Peter was acting in an hypocritical way with, at the moment of the meal, to be shared or not with the members, non-Jewish members of the community. And here you have the famous passage, the very famous passage. And I believe, so I started working in this direction, and I believe that actually the entire epistle to the Romans is but a kind of continuation of sequel to the epistle to the Galatians. So it's a kind of putting into perspective the very radical perspective that Paul exposed in the epistle to the Galatians, going into the same direction and becoming more precise with just one little difference, that actually in the Epistle to the Romans, at least Paul was not naming the adversary, was not naming the hypocritical person. So at least Peter was not named. And of course, this is an internal polemic within the Messianic movement. So is
To wrap up, Pierluigi, I apologize. Yeah.
Thank you. And so I found this example, this passage interesting and instructing. And when we go back, so these images to me, it was also nice and very representative. It's a medieval fragment of a fresco, but you can see the kissy meeting in Rome, totally apocryphal between Peter and Paul, but at the same time with this breach on the face of Peter, it's interesting because this is representative to me of a certain kind of polemics between them, between the two different approaches. In the end, yes, by default, I would say, yes, the Jesus movement is totally, historically, at least until 135, the end of the Second War, it's totally inside Second Temple Judaism, before and after the fall of the temple. Having said that, yes, I totally agree with this perspective. Having said that, also inside the Jesus movement, there are different sensitivities and different approaches, and these different approaches are interacting polemically. And here, in the Epistle to the Galatians and the Epistle to the Romans, we have the demonstration that actually Paul was reacting and also dealing not writing against Judaism, but against perhaps some other colleagues, some other missionaries, so an internal polemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierluigi. And we're going to come back now to Crispin. Hopefully the technical aspects have been resolved.
Yeah, I hope so too. I got to get the right screen, that one there.
Okay.
Good, we can see your screen.
Okay. Right, can you see, what can you see now? Can you see something that's appropriate?
I mean, we see two different like replications.
We've got your presenter view.
Oh no, okay. Well, why don't I put that over there? And no, that's no better, is it? What shall I do? What do you suggest?
If you're working on multiple screens, you just have to select the screen that your slideshow is going to go on, and then show that whole screen.
Yeah.
And that's via the share screen with via Zoom. So you have to change what you're sharing via Zoom to that particular screen.
Okay.
Otherwise, your alternative is to go down to one screen and then share that, but then you'd probably lose your notes.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to go down to one screen. Can you still hear me, guys?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I hope I still have the time allotted that I was originally allotted.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, so let's go. So I'm here to talk about Paul's letter to the Philippians, and to say a little bit about my the results, the arguments and findings of my book, The Divine Heart Set. In essence and in summary, there are a few ways in which this book supports and consolidates within the Within Judaism approach. In several ways, my book, there was a challenge to the Within Judaism approach, at least as that is currently practiced by its leading voices in the interpretation of this letter. Time is short, so I'm going to concentrate on the challenge. One thing I like about the Within Judaism approach is the insistence that if we are to be responsible historians, we should let Paul be weird. Too often we've distorted our image of Paul, made him too familiar in the image of our own traditional Christian version of Paul. If there is a genuine challenge in my work, if that it is that existing readings of Philippians, including Within Judaism readings, make him too familiar, not weird enough. So in this book, I set out a whole new approach to the translation and interpretation of the Christ hymn in Philippians 2:6. So a few comments to begin with on the journey leading to this book. When I first studied this Christ hymn, I was taught that it made sense in a Jewish context. Adam speculation, we thought, is the key. So too in the case of the important material in Philippians 3, where Christa Stendahl famously found that before turning to Christ, against the assumptions of his later Western interpreters, Paul had a robust conscience. Paul in Philippians 3:6 with confidence writes, "As to righteousness under the law, blameless I was." The interpretive conceptual furniture has lately been rearranged a little, but many still read these passages within a version of the older Jewish versus Christian or Christian versus Jewish Christian competitive framework. Some now think it is not Adam but angelology that is key to the hymn's Christology. On chapter 3, some Within Judaism scholars now argue that Paul speaks to a Gentile, not a Christian desire, to a Gentile, not a Jewish Christian desire for circumcision. But most now follow the approach Stendahl initiated. In Philippians 3:4-6, Paul still thinks in his former life he was, quote unquote, a terrific Jew. He does not renounce his former way of life. He simply values its benefits less in the light of Christ. My book is a result of my own several-step transition away from a Jewish and Jewish Christian paradigm for the interpretation of much, though not all, in this letter. I started from the realization that there were likely no or very few Jewish Christ followers in Philippi, as most agree, and frequently Paul's language is strikingly different to that of the letters to communities that included Jewish Christ followers. So to the hymn. A fine-grained analysis of the language shows that here, out of a desire to speak meaningfully to his Gentile readers, Paul dares to be, or to sound, rather un-Jewish. On my translation, readers are meant to hear Homeric syntax in the God-equal mode or manner of being, philosophical, that is especially Platonic categories of divine being that becomes, in red, centuries-old terminology from the realm of popular religion for the god's self-transformations, in green, language that evokes Greek and Roman ruler cults, highlighted in yellow, interaction with the contested character of love and Greek eros from Sappho onwards. The divine Messiah rejects the aggressive sexual conduct of the pagan gods, or pagmos, their rapes and kidnapped marriages. He reveals another kind of love in becoming human, a version of the kind Yahweh has for Israel in the Hebrew Bible. A major theme is also the portrayal of Christ as a model of civic virtue. According to the canon of Greek virtues, he is sophron. He has sophrosuner, in that he truly knows himself. Think of the Delphic maxim, gnothi se auton, know yourself. In verse 6, he knows what is fitting for a deity, and he acts accordingly. All rather weird, at least to most of us. It was weird to me at first. But familiar themes for Paul's first-century Gentile readers. Of course, there is the scriptural citation from Isaiah 45. At Philippians 4:1, there is also, I argue, a debt to Jewish liturgical tradition, with the community of Philippians as Paul's crown. But even with Isaiah 45:23, the hymn's interpretive strategy is best explained as a form of prosopological exegesis of the kind long practiced by Hellenistic Homeric scholars. The rest of the letter, outside of the traditional hymn which Paul quotes, is devoid of scriptural citation, and there are no angels anywhere to be seen. The Christology is expressed in terms of Greek and Roman themes, more or less familiar to every Jew, no doubt, but not native Jewish categories, and for some Jews, themes to be resisted. Some comments on Philippians 3, especially verses 4-6. About these verses, the Within Judaism approach must surely be right about two things. With the mutilation of 3:2, Paul is not saying that Jewish circumcision is a mutilation. And Stendhal was half right about 3:6. There, Paul does not have a troubled conscience like Luther's. But that is not to say that he is not in trouble. From the perspective of the Apostle Paul, the Paul of 3:4-6 is in deep, deep trouble. I conclude in my study. Here I reckon these are I reckon the key steps to understanding verses 4-6. 1. The opening lines of chapter 3 develop themes in the first 2 chapters. 2. There is no evidence in Philippians of the problems that are all too familiar to Pauline scholars who come to this letter from Galatians, Romans, and 2 Corinthians, thinking Paul must be warning against some kind of Judaizer. Paul has told us in chapters 1-2 who his readers' opponents are. They are those who would lure his readers away from the highest standards of civic virtue, away from love to fear of the threatening other, away from a growth in moral judgment, away from humble-mindedness towards venal corruption, serving only party interests, vainglory, the competitive pursuit of honor. As to form, number 3, the short staccato lines of verses 5-6 echo the kinds of praises and boasting preserved today in public honorific inscriptions. In the ancient world, honorific praise of others was fine to be encouraged, but self-praise was almost always problematic, the posture of the uncouth and dangerous braggart, the alazone of Romans 1:30. So Paul's praise of himself here is an unvirtuous contrast to the praise of the virtuous Christ and of Timothy and Epaphroditus in the previous chapter. These lines are quite different in form and some of their content to those in Galatians 1:13-14. And to the non-Jewish reader who has been following the train of Paul's argument, it will be obvious that Paul is characterizing himself as the worst of sinners. The worst of sinners by the standards of Greek civic virtue, that is. The worst of sinners by the measure of the philosophically informed expectations of the statesman, who should be zealous to serve and protect, not to attack, his own people, envying no one, neither boasting in himself nor in his own people, clan or tribe, but seeking the interests of the whole community. So this is a highly ironic, tragic, foolish boast, one his pagans would consider shameful, and they would at once recognize it as theatre. In the letter thus far, Paul has modelled a non-competitive culture of honour. In verse 4, he steps into a new character, sparring with others for honour. He boasts of his good and noble birth as a philosophically aware civic leader who encourages his readers at 127 to, quote, engage in public life in a manner worthy of the gospel. He should know better. Such boasting betrays the logic of the good news that Christ came for humans in 2:8, not for any particular people group. In 2:3, Paul had warned against vainglory. Here, he models it. In 2:3, he enjoins humble-mindedness. Here, he lacks it altogether. Self-praise could be acceptable if one gave credit to others, especially to the gods. Paul does not. In these verses, Paul boasts in the flesh. There is no contradiction with what he says in verse 3, because in verses 5-6, Paul takes on a role. He is acting, pretending to be a properly weird kind of a Jew, what you might even call a pagan idolatrous Jew. I could go on. There is much more to be said for a rather new interpretation of the passage. It's a weird Paul, a theatrical and ironic Paul, but one whose posture makes sense here in this letter to this audience. So obviously, against Stendhal, Paul is not here at ease with his former life as a Pharisee, blameless in his life of Torah. In celebrating his envious hounding of his people's assembly like a dog, Paul sends himself up as the worst of sinners, a self-mutilator. This is Paul the madman, a new Sophoclean Ajax attacking his own people. All this means also that verse 6 presents the law as inadequate to the task of fostering praiseworthy civic virtue. So there is a radical epistemological shift at verse 7, a conversion. But I should stress, having called it a conversion, we should not treat verses 4-6 as straightforward, historically useful autobiography. To conclude, the Jewish interpretive framework for reading Philippians, I contend, has made Paul's argument too familiar, too close to 21st century forms of Christianity. And if my arguments are anywhere near the mark, this letter poses many questions for those of us who want to understand Paul's relationship with Judaism. There you go. Do I need to stop sharing? How do I stop sharing?
I can do that for you.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you, Crispin. I'm glad the technical aspects worked, and thank you for abiding by the time frame. We're going to move on to our next presenter, Kathy Ahrensberger.
Hi, Isaac, and everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. I will try to be brief and more colloquial to you, and I try to answer your questions or follow your questions, Isaac. So I'm very virtuous, I think, ironically. But my preamble to everything is, why do you, you ask, why do you think a text should be or not within Judaism? Why are asking me this question? For me, the question is asked because we always deal with presuppositions, hermeneutical presuppositions. And the way I was taught the hermeneutical presupposition of my reading of New Testament texts was they were not Jewish. They were something else. So my first challenge is not were they Jewish or not, or what were they, but what are the presuppositions with which we read, and which frame our reading, So what if we do not presuppose what I learned during my days at university, but presuppose they were part, like Gabriele and so many say, they were part of this diversity of Judaism. What if we do that? Test that, like Mark, you also said. What if we test that? So that would be my preamble to all what I'm going to say. Well, why do I think, with this preamble, with this testing preamble, why do I think a text, a Pauline text, okay, I talk about the 7 undisputed letters, one of these texts, or all of these texts should be read within, as the label goes now. I don't want to discuss now Judaism and all that stuff, so that's the label we use. Well, my question then is, well, what else should it be? What else should it be? If we want to categorize into certain cultural, I don't know, religious or whatever categories, what else should it be? It is obviously not something that relates to all these other deities to which people related at the time we're talking about. It is obviously also not Christianity as we know it. It has not been established yet. There is no formal creed like after Nicaea and so on. So what else should it be? All of these texts, these Pauline texts, relate very obviously to the one God of Israel. And they advocate that the addressees should relate to this one God of Israel exclusively. Well, nobody in the Mediterranean world at that time advocated that except Jews. So why then should these texts which advocate that not be Jewish? And if there are aspects in these texts, in these Pauline texts, that are not found in any other Jewish tradition of the time, well, so what? There's many stuff in Philo that is, etc., etc. I'm repeating myself. So then I look at these Pauline letters. Now that's directly from what Crispin just said. I think Paul did self-identify as a Pharisee. I think he says, I'm loyal to the Torah, etc., etc. He does self-identify, especially in Romans, with his people. I'm an Israelite. I don't think this is polemical, even if we go along with what you just told us, Crispin. So the question, whether something is within or without, however we define that, only emerges with regard to Paul's addressees. They obviously are, as most of us within Judaism advocates think, they are not Jews. And they are not supposed to be Jews. So if we want to say something, is this now within or without, that has to do with the addressees. But does that render his letters outside? Or is it not Jewish tradition for non-Jews? A variation of Jewish tradition for people who are not supposed to become Jewish, sort of a non-Jewish way of being Jewish, or whatever words we want to use for that. I do think more questions do arise when we move to the disputed letters, but that's not my topic today. So I'm just talking about the non-disputed. So the dividing line, in my view, the essential dividing line at the time of Paul's writing, the temple still stands, etc., is where do you belong? There are people who claim or who want to belong exclusively to this one God. And some of them are traditionally what we call Jews. And then there are others now who, in the wake of this conviction of this coming of the Messiah, also cross that line and want to belong or do belong or should belong exclusively to this one God of Israel. And the others do not. So I'm not talking about those who add on deities to their pantheon, God-fearers as they are called or so, but those who exclude it. There's an exclusiveness in this commitment. So that's why I think the Pauline text, the undisputed letters, should be localized within the realm of Jewish tradition of the time. Now, you asked then, Isaac, in your great questions, what are the criteria that we use? Well, I just said criteria is this a text that relates, positions those he addresses, those who self-identify as on the side of this one God of Israel? I think this is one criterion. I would ask, what does this text advocate? I'm still talking about a New Testament text, in particular Paul pre-70. Then a next criterion would be, what is the authoritative guidance that is by which this belonging is characterized? What is the authoritative guidance to which Paul refers? It is the scriptures of Israel. Even if he does use Greek allusions to Greek texts, allusions to Greek thinking, to Stoic thinking, as we know, if his ways of trying to find meaning in a text reminds us of some Homeric things, the authoritative text is neither Homer nor Plato. The authoritative texts are the scriptures of Israel. The message he proclaims is about a Messiah which comes from the Davidic line of Israel. Well, is this something that is found in any other tradition? No. So this is another criterion. I would say this is within the Judaism of the time. So, and then there is a clear distinction line. I say it again. Who is cultically worshipped? Who is supposed to be cultically worshipped? And who is not? I think the dividing line is very clear. Now, yes, it is a Jewish, I think the difference to other Jewish discourses is the Pauline discourse is a Jewish discourse for non-Jews. And that eventually something else develops out of this over the centuries, I don't consider an accident. There are some indications in Paul that says, well, you're not supposed to be Jews, so test everything and retain what is good. I hear that as, yes, there are aspects in other traditions which may well cohere with being in Christ as a non-Jew. But that does not lead outside. That is not against Jewish traditions. So what changes when we read within? Well, I think the framework changes. That's what I say. We change the framework. We try to read, what if we read this within the context of Jewish traditions of the time? That is pre-separation. That is pre the frameworks of the 2nd and 3rd century. That is pre political interactions and socio-political conflicts that emerge, etc. Just try to do it. And Mark already mentions the issue of translation, which I think is a very, very decisive issue. I just mentioned one thing, a dear colleague of mine from Vienna, Hans Förster, has written about. He has written about the anti-Semitic comma in 1 Thessalonians 2:14 and 15, which he argues, I'm not a philologist, but he argues if there is no comma in this notoriously difficult and text, I wish Paul hadn't written it, but if there is no comma there, then the participle that follows is the how does he say, distinguishing participle, which indicates that these particular Jews who, rather than all Jews, in the place where Jesus was killed. Anyway, it doesn't change dramatically, but it changes to some extent what Paul is saying. Okay, I'm just saying, paying with the changing framework or testing what happens if we change the framework of reading. I think we come to other readings. I'm not claiming right or wrong. I think these are not the categories to deal with. But what changes? What can we hear? What emerges out of these texts if we change the hermeneutical presuppositions? And for me, and I position myself very clearly also politically and in terms of an agenda, I write about this. That comes from feminist hermeneutics. Be open. I try to be as historically objective as I can, but I can never jump out of my skin. So of course I do have an agenda. I embrace Christian tradition, and I hope there are ways to embrace this tradition without being fundamentally anti-Jewish. So I talk about this, so you know where I stand. That's what I have to say at the moment, and I hope it contributes to a lively discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy, for interacting with those questions. And you've raised some very important points of discussion that I'm sure we're going to come back to. We transition now to Jason Staples, thriving adjunct. I like the signature under your name. Jason, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Well, first of all, I want to thank Isaac and the organizers in general for putting this event together and for the invitation to contribute. It's always an honor to be among such distinguished folks as we have here. Actually, before I continue, though, I can't resist. I should observe that based on the criteria that were just put forward there, that we're talking about the God of Israel specifically, and then resting on the primary authority of the Scriptures of Israel. Justin Martyr fits the same fits the criteria that were just suggested. As does, say, First Clement and a whole host. So maybe we should be considering Justin Martyr within Judaism in that context. I do wonder where those boundaries go. So that's somewhat tongue in cheek, but I do think that foregrounds the difficulties that we're dealing with as soon as we start to bring up this question. Now, I also want to point out, I fully agree about the comma in 1 Thessalonians 2:14. No translation should ever have it in there. I've argued this in print. It is inexcusable that a modern translation where people are philologically aware have that comma. It's, yeah. Anyway, now, like Kathy, I went through the questions sort of in turn. And again, the first question, why do you think Paul should or should not be treated as within Judaism? On the one hand, my knee-jerk reaction to this is that the answer is an obvious affirmative. I mean, he's obviously a Jewish man from the first century whose life and practice are defined by his understanding and interpretation of Torah. He believed the Torah was divinely inspired and needed to be properly fulfilled. He says this more than once. This is true both before and after he concluded that Jesus was the prophet Messiah that was promised in the Torah. So, I mean, as such, seems to me pretty obvious that Paul should be considered alongside and in light of other ancient Jewish materials and sources as a part of that whole, the same basic context. And if that's what it means to think of Paul within Judaism, then the answer is an obvious yes, full stop. But to borrow from Tevye, the milkman, on the other hand, this is a much thornier question than it initially seems, because and actually Isaac, you referenced the John von Maren article that I think highlights this very well at the front. Judaism as an ism first has to be defined before we can situate Paul or anyone or anything else within it, and that has been, I think, a thorny theological and categorical and theoretical problem for the within Judaism material to date. I mean, I think, as von Maren says, I mean, a bunch more theoretical problems are introduced by the fact that within Judaism combines boundary language within, spatial type language with an abstract noun that describes sort of a fuzzy family of thought and behavior. And how are we going to set the boundaries of Judaism? I mean, which one of us is qualified to say, okay, that's Judaism and that's not? I mean, I'm not on the, Israeli high rabbinate, so I'm not qualified for that, and certainly none of us for the ancient world really fit there. So what does it mean then to be within Jewish thought and behavior, and who gets to define those fuzzy boundaries? And especially once we go back far enough, I mean, if by within Judaism we mean to suggest that Paul would fit comfortably in a modern synagogue, or even an ancient one, if we take seriously his testimony of receiving 39 lashes 5 different times, then, if that's what it is to be within Judaism, then Paul was hardly more within Judaism than he was an evangelical Christian. Now, this is where the danger is, that we exchange a Christian Paul, who I think one of the real benefits of the within Judaism scholarship to date has been a recognition that a Christian Paul is under theorized and very much mistaken in all sorts of ways. But the danger is that we exchange a Christian Paul who's sufficiently domesticated from his ancient context to fit comfortably in the pews at 33rd Baptist Church of Keokuk, Iowa, or where are you right now, Isaac? Peoria, or 44th Baptist of Peoria, Illinois, for an equally domesticated Paul within Judaism, sufficiently defanged to make him non-threatening in a modern Reform synagogue. And, in my view, the first century apostle was not so tame. And to whatever extent we treat Paul within Judaism, we have to recognize that difference. He was obviously not within Christianity as we know it, as Kathy just said. I fully agree. But nor was he within Judaism as we now know it in that same sense. And so whatever Judaism he is participating in, it's a Judaism kind of its own in some sense as well, although very much in trajectory with and part of the stream of common Judaism that we see in the ancient world. And I think that's important to note. So that in mind, when we get to the second question, to me, the criteria for determining whether a text or author is or is not within Judaism, I think first we have to ask ourselves, is the text or author produced by someone from a community that self-identified and was identified by others as Jewish? And you notice I say that they were from such a community because this could mean either past or present embeddedness. So this would apply equally to a proselyte or to a schismatic Jewish heretic. Either one would be within Judaism by this definition. And then the second question is the author or text situated within the sacred history and foundational narratives of the people of Israel? And if the answer to that is yes, then I think the author or text should be considered as within Judaism. Now, one of the problems here is that the answer to the first isn't always obvious. There are more than a few texts that meet the second criterion, but are anonymous, or are by, in some cases, they're not by Jews, as with Justin Martyr, but in many cases, they're anonymous, such as the New Testament Gospels and some other texts where we're not sure. So, that gets more difficult. As far as what changes when a text is read within Judaism, to me, it's really about how we understand the context of the author or text in question. Kathy's right that that presuppositions matter. And it's not just our presuppositions, but it's the context in which the author and the text themselves are situated. So who are the conversation partners that the author is communicating with in the ancient world? Who is this person writing to? And as we read, it is really incumbent on us as readers to make ourselves as much like the audience to whom the author was writing, and the people with whom the author is in dialogue. As we need to become like them as much as possible. And if we're going to do that, we have to recognize the benefit of the within Judaism kind of perspective is that we have to situate ourselves sufficiently within the sort of norms and assumptions that are shared by Jews in the ancient world to be able to read Paul better and to be able to read other texts in that larger mainstream and the fringes of that better. So I think that's really what we're trying to do. To me, reading Paul within Judaism means we're looking to see how he uses and develops biblical texts and other early Jewish text traditions and narratives, and then looking at how those common elements help us situate ourselves so that we can understand his letters. In the same way that I wouldn't want to try to evaluate a modern internet meme without having any idea about what movies, TV shows, or other contextual elements are actually involved in the production of that meme. We're going to miss the meaning. So to understand Paul historically, we have to take his rootedness in the Torah and foundational narratives of Judaism seriously. And if that's what it means to understand Paul or to think of Paul within Judaism, then yes, Paul should be considered within Judaism. After all, he apparently considered himself sufficiently Jewish to subject himself to synagogue discipline, not once, not twice, but 5 times. he could have severed his contact with the synagogues and so on and avoided the beatings. But he apparently just kept saying, "Thank you, sir, may I have another," and going right back. So he considered himself within himself in that respect. So, as the old saying goes, if it was good enough for Paul, I think we kind of have to go there. But if within Judaism means that we must interpret Paul from our own perspective with special attention to modern concerns about modern anti-Judaism rather than historical precision, or that we must understand Paul as identifying all Israel as restricted to Jews alone, unlike other Jews in his day, or the idea that Paul doesn't think that Jews need to follow Jesus in order to be saved or preserved through the judgment, or that Paul thinks that Jews and Gentiles have different paths to salvation, however that's understood. And these are all arguments that I've seen from Paul within Judaism scholars. If that's what it is to understand Paul within Judaism, then no, I don't think Paul is within that Judaism. So I think in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and wrap there, but hopefully I've given us enough food for our future discussion.
Thank you, Jason. I feel like we have a discussion going on here now, some nice interaction already occurring between the panelists. And just pointing out, Susan Wendo has a wonderful contribution coming up in our next forthcoming volume, Paul, Luke and Acts within Judaism, on Justin Martyr. And we will discuss Justin Martyr in the fall, is the second half of this conference. I'm going to move now. I want to say Jakub or Jakub Pogonoski. I apologize for mispronouncing your name. We can't hear you for the time being, or at least I can't. Still unable to hear.
You might need to adjust which microphone your Zoom is using. If you go to the little caret by your audio, it should let you select a different microphone.
We can move to the next until.
We'll come back to you if that's okay, but just at the bottom of audio, there might be some settings there that you can adjust. So we'll come back. Let's move on, therefore, to Robert Foster.
Yes, hello. Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So, hello, thank you so much. I want to say a very warm thank you to the conference, for Isaac, for everyone who's putting this on and who has invited me to participate. And I can't help noticing that the question is Paul and others, Mark, etc., within Judaism, question mark. And that's a question mark I kind of want to lean on heavily in my presentation. And it's not because I think that Paul was not in Judaism, but because I think that there are some methodological questions that need to be raised and that need to be pressed, especially as Paul portrays the indices of Jewish ethnicity, of Jewish religious practice in his letters. And I think that there are some questions about how the data is distributed among Paul's letters. And so I want to take a look at some passages. None of them will be new. None of them will be surprising. They're things that have been discussed and reviewed endlessly. But I do want to point them out and make some fresh comments in closing. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And I would like to start with this verse from 2 Corinthians 5:17. Can everyone see this?
We cannot see your screen.
Okay. Oh, I have to actually hit the share button there.
There we go.
Okay, is that it?
It's appearing, yeah.
And
start the show.
Okay.
Good. Yes.
Okay, great. I would like to start with this verse from 2 Corinthians. It says, "So if anyone is in Christ, there's a new creation. Old things have passed away. See, everything has become new." 2 Corinthians 15:7. And Paul does not really say in this passage what these old things that have passed away are, what they include. And so we have to take a look at some other passages to see if Paul gives any indication of what old things have passed away with the coming of Christ, with the newness that the Messiah brings. And I want to start with this verse from Galatians 6:15, where Paul says, "For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation." And I want to be very, very quick to point out that I don't believe that just quoting this verse proves anything. Just quoting the verse doesn't really say anything. I didn't believe that when I got up this morning, and I certainly don't believe it now after hearing the presentation that Mark Nanos presented at the beginning of the conference. There's a lot of issues that need to be teased out. But I do want to suggest that the form, the parallel language in these two verses suggests that perhaps that it's plausible, it's arguable that the new creation, the old things that pass away in light of the new creation, might include circumcision. And of course, there are some other passages in Galatians 5. Paul seems to argue that circumcision, being circumcised and being in Christ are mutually exclusive categories. In Philippians 3, 4-7, he lists his Jewish privileges, including being circumcised on the 8th day. He goes on to say that in light of Christ, all of this is crap. And of course, another passage in 1 Corinthians 7:19, parallel to the Galatians 6:15 one. These suggest that perhaps they indicate that it's possible that the things that have passed away include circumcision. But on the other hand, we have the statement from Romans where Paul emphatically says, "What value is circumcision?" Well, much in every way. And it seems to be a very firm statement on the ongoing significance and the value of circumcision. Another Jewish indus that Paul addresses is the practice of Torah, of course. And I would suggest that this passage in Galatians, where Paul says that the law was a custodian until Christ, it opens the door to the possibility that the law, at least in this function, the history of his people, the Jewish people under the law, has sort of is one of the old things that has passed away with the coming of the Messiah. Of course, again in Galatians, there are some other verses where Paul says that like circumcision, Torah and Christ seem to be mutually exclusive categories, at least as he presents his argument. In 2 Corinthians 3:7, Paul talks about the glory that Moses had as the mediator of a former covenant. And he says that glory has now been set aside, right? And in 1 Corinthians 15:56, Paul suggests that if the law is still active in the present age, it switched sides, because in this verse he says that the law is the power of sin. And of course in Ephesians, there's a statement that whoever wrote it, that in Christ, the law of commandments and decrees that separate Jew from Gentile has been brought down. But of course, this is not everything that Paul says about the law. He says emphatically in Romans 3:31 that we don't do away with the law, we uphold the law. He goes on to call it holy and say that the commandment is holy and just and good in Romans 7. And then, of course, in Romans 9, where he's listing the privileges of the Jewish, of his fellow Israelites, he includes the giving of the law. So again, we see some tension here between how Paul sort of renders these indices of Jewish ethnicity and religious practice in his letters. One final aspect of Jewish religious practice that I want to look at is temple practice and adherence to the Torah. So, of course, very important to first century Judaism, Second Temple Judaism. And Paul, I don't think Paul says much that gives a lot of indications one way or the other. But there is this passage in 2 Corinthians 6:16, just after he has said, in Christ, everything is new, new creation, all the old has passed away. Just in the next chapter, and paragraph later, he goes on to say that we are the temple of the living God. And I understand that there's not an article here, like in the other places that Paul refers to his congregation, the Corinthians, as the temple of God. There's no article Some translations say you are a temple of God. But given this passage in 2 Corinthians 6 coming after chapter 5 and verse 17, it's at least possible that that Paul indicates in this verse that the newness of Christ's coming transfers the locus of his temple activity to the Christ followers. Of course, you do have this passage in 1 Corinthians 9:13 where Paul is making an analogy, arguing that ministers of the gospel are entitled to receive support. And he draws an analogy to the ministers of the priests in the temple. I'm not convinced that you can put a lot of weight on that to infer what Paul thinks about a temple practice. But you do have, of course, this passage in Romans 9:4, where again, Paul listing the privileges of the Israelites, his fellow Israelites from God. He mentions the worship, or the latreia. And I think this is clearly, as most scholars agree, a reference to the temple worship and the temple practices. And so I want to reiterate that it is not the case that I think just putting these verses up on a screen settles the question of how Paul should be situated within Judaism. That's not the point of Galatians 6:15 or any of these other passages. What I want to draw attention to, however, is that when we organize, or we try to sort of categorize Paul's various statements relating to this subject, I think it does become clear that Romans is in a unique situation. Romans is a unique case. And Paul says things in Romans that he does not say in his other letters, and vice versa. And I think that it's very common in the Paul within Judaism school, so-called. I think Jason Staples has done a really good job stressing some of the problems with that label. But one of the practices is to use Romans as sort of like the gold standard. In Romans, Paul sort of opens up, he gives us his heart, he lays his cards on the table, and this is where we find what Paul really has to say about these issues and about his Jewishness. And these other passages are going to be sort of given rendered in such a way that they come in line with what Paul has to say in Romans. And so I want to question that a little bit. I don't think that there's any, that the letters of Paul don't anywhere sort of give us a warrant for saying that Romans is sort of the gold standard. Romans is the measuring rod for assessing what Paul really meant, what he really said. And we can maneuver these other texts into line with what he says there. And I think this is especially the case because, at least to me personally, Romans is most obviously the letter where Paul engages in sustained impression management. And it's also a letter where he is explicitly asking for money. And so it seems like the default should be that Romans is the most rhetorically spun letter, if you will. And should not necessarily be the basis for evaluating what Paul has to say in his other letters. And so, really, what I would like to present is just kind of a methodological challenge that people trying to situate Paul within Judaism, with especially members of the Paul within Judaism school. I would like to see them account for the oddness of Paul's letter to the Romans and the uniqueness of Romans precisely on those issues that is most important to them. And I would like to see some more engagement on the other letters without using Romans as a hermeneutical constraint that can maneuver his meaning into the preferred direction. So that's all I have to say on that issue. Did I make my time? I forgot to set my timer.
Perfect. Yep. 9 minutes and 48 seconds.
Great.
Thank you, Robert. We're going to turn back to Jakub Pogonoski. I hope now your mic is working.
Yes. Is it better now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Excellent. Wonderful.
Good.
Yes.
Good. Okay. So thank you for having me here. It's a big privilege to present my paper. And I'll focus on the letter to Galatians to see whether it can be considered within Judaism. And to do so, I will apply two criteria to interpretations of Paul's Nomos discourse. I will argue that the understanding of Paul's attitude to Torah in Galatians, presented by many scholars, effectively places Paul outside of Judaism. Nevertheless, I believe that Paul should be viewed as being within Judaism, provided that we reconsider and redefine the object of his negative comments in his Nomos discourse. I'll try to answer the questions as well. And the first question was, what are the criteria for determining that a text is or is not within Judaism? According to my definition, the text is within Judaism when it is within the framework of the heritage of the people of Israel as outlined in the Hebrew Bible, including its Second Temple interpretations. The two main criteria that I will discuss in this paper are as follows. First one, does the text engage with the discourse evidenced in the literature of the period, addressing the issues discussed by Second Temple Judeans? And the second one, does the text engage with the categories present in the Hebrew Bible and or Second Temple texts? Now, regarding the first criterion, both the Lutheran and the New Perspective on Paul interpretations of Galatians highlight Paul's focus on issues not present in the Second Temple texts. The notion that Second Temple Judaism was a legalistic religion of works righteousness has been refuted by Sanders already 50 years ago. Regrettably, some scholars still stick to that perspective. But the New Perspective on Paul also introduces a new category of ethnic markers, which overlaps with the older notion of ritual commandments. This taxonomy is not present in the Hebrew Bible, Second Temple texts, or even the New Testament. Paul within Judaism authors also frequently presuppose the distinction between the ritual and moral commandments. The Gentiles within the Jesus movement are regarded as Torah observant on the basis of their adherence to an abridged version of the Torah. A number of scholars claim that the practice of these Jewish commandments, as they say, was not acceptable for Paul if performed by Gentiles. Nevertheless, it is probable that Paul's initial Gentile audience was composed of Gentiles who already observed certain commandments of the Torah. In his Mystery of Romans, Mark Nanos has argued that these individuals likely belonged to synagogue subgroups, and the long-standing perspective asserting that Paul was in opposition to the enforcement of the Torah upon otherwise non-Torah observant Gentiles is, from a historical standpoint, questionable. One may also legitimately ask why Paul would be so insistent in discouraging these people from observing Torah. This kind of attitude would not have any precedent in the Hebrew Bible, Second Temple text, or social realities of the first century Mediterranean world. Indeed, a substantial body of evidence, both from the Judean and pagan sources, suggests that a considerable number of Gentiles were present at synagogues and voluntarily adhered to various commandments of the Torah. This practice was considered acceptable by both Judean and Gentile communities, although it was not without its critics among the Roman literary elite. It is often argued that these Gentiles are not to keep the Torah because they do not become Israelites, but rather an otherwise unspecified God's people. Nevertheless, neither the Hebrew Bible nor the Second Temple texts, nor even the writings of the New Testament entertain the idea of God's people as something distinct from Israel. In fact, many New Testament texts appear to equate the Jesus movement with Israel. Sometimes it is assumed that using the term Israel to refer to the followers of Jesus is supersessionist. However, from the beginning of the Second Temple period, there have been constant attempts to redefine Israel according to the borders set by a given group and exclude outsiders. Therefore, defining Israel according to one's own criteria and even excluding other descendants of Abraham from the covenant of Israel is fully within the scope of Second Temple Judaism. Whereas the concept of a separate entity of God's people consisting of Gentiles who worship the God of Israel is not. Overall, most current approaches interpret Galatians as a manifesto of freedom from the Torah. The scholarly consensus is that Gentiles are not expected to implement the entirety of the Torah in their lives, and if the full Torah praxis remains valid only for Judeans, the inevitable outcome is the practical abandonment of Torah praxis within the Jesus movement. If we accept this interpretation of the Nomos discourse in Galatians and other Pauline texts, the apostle cannot be positioned within Judaism. This is because we do not find any discussions regarding the validity of the Torah in the Hebrew Bible, Second Temple text, or even other New Testament writings. The subject under discussion during the Second Temple period was the accurate interpretation and application of the Torah. Halacha was at the center of Second Temple religious discourse. Now, I want to move to the last question. What changes when we read Galatians within Judaism, according to this definition that I gave at the beginning? In my opinion, a key issue that enables antinomian readings of Galatians is an assumption that nomos should always be translated as Torah or the law in Paul's letters. And here I side with Mark Nanos that translation is crucial in this matter. In Galatians 1:13, Paul explicitly states that he was formerly zealous for the paradoxes of the fathers. This term also appears in Matthew 15 and Mark 7, where it refers to non-Pentateuchal laws, which Jesus criticizes because, according to him, they violate the Torah. This terminology, connected to the extra-biblical tradition of the Pharisees, is coupled with the recurring theme of the human origin of what Paul criticizes in Galatians. This is consistent with Jesus' critique of the Pharisees and similar to the critique of the Pharisees in Qumran writings. Setting aside concerns of modern critical scholarship, it is highly unlikely that a first-century Judean would describe the law of Moses as originating from man. Thus, a possible way out of the dead end of an antinomian Paul is to assume that passages in which he criticizes nomos refer to halachic traditions that are different from or even contrary to the Torah, according to Paul. Mark Nanos has proposed that the entire conflict in Galatia concerned prevailing norms regarding proselyte transformation. Subsequently, he argued that the well-known erga nomou phrase referred to an extra-biblical rite of proselyte transformation rather than performing the law of Moses. Although Nanos did not state this explicitly, it opens the way to reconsidering other verses from Paul's nomos discourse as pertaining to some extra-biblical halacha. Similarly, a few years ago, Daniel Boyarin concluded that Paul's critique of Judaismos in Galatians 1:13-14 was aimed at certain Pharisaic practices and not the Pentateuch itself. Taken together, the conclusions of Nanos and Boyarin suggest that Paul's challenging nomos statements are in opposition to certain extra-biblical traditions of his opponents. When presented this way, Paul is fully within Second Temple Judaism. Various groups of that period did not discuss whether the Torah should be kept or whether Gentiles could have a relationship with God without accepting the Torah. It was halacha that fueled the debates in the Second Temple period, and it was halachic disputes that created sects. Paul, like his contemporaries, is doing just that. He does not discuss the necessity or role of keeping the Torah, either for Gentiles or Judeans. In my view, Galatians is a sophisticated halachic text dealing with one of the most widely discussed topics of the Second Temple period. Now, concluding, Crispin has argued that the issue of foreigners joining Israel was one of the key factors that contributed to the emergence of sects within Second Temple Judaism. I would argue that many of Paul's complex statements in Galatians relate to extra-biblical halacha concerning the separation of Israel from the nations. The idea of separation is generally present in the Torah itself. However, during the Second Temple period, halachic measures to separate from Gentiles significantly increased. These halachot differentiate the earlier stages of Israelite identity from the Second Temple Judean identity. According to Paul, the inclusion of Gentiles in the covenant of Israel was the Torah's original intent, as revealed to Abraham in Genesis 12. This promise was repeated to Jacob, who was to become a congregation of nations, Kahal Goim, and this is later rephrased in Genesis 14:8-18, where it states that Ephraim is to become Melo HaGoim, the fullness of nations, mentioned by Paul in Romans 11:25. Paul calls his ex-Gentiles the seed of Abraham, which univocally means Israelites in the Hebrew Bible, Second Temple text, and even the New Testament. Jason Staples has recently also provided a detailed and persuasive argument that Paul viewed his former Gentiles as members of the covenant of Israel. If this group belongs to Israel, however, there is no reason to argue that they are subject only to the abridged Torah. Instead, they should be viewed as members of the new covenant with the Mosaic Torah written on their hearts. When we accept that Paul's criticism of the nomos is directed at certain halachic traditions intended to reinforce the divide between Israel and the nations, the issue becomes apparent. Both Paul and his opponents believed that a relationship with God was only possible within the covenant of Israel. However, they differed in understanding of how the process of getting in transpires. Those whom Paul opposed argued that the proselyte transformation was the only way to enter the covenant of Israel, be purified, and establish a relationship with God. The apostle, however, argued that this This extra-biblical procedure was important in this regard. For Paul, the only way to secure a relationship with God was through the sacrifice of the Messiah of Israel, Jesus, whom the apostle believed to be the ultimate form of purification, resulting in holiness manifested by the bestowal of the Spirit. Thus, Paul neither negates the Torah nor raises the previously undiscussed topic of its validity. He does not propose novel concepts such as ritual commandments, nor does he advocate the establishment of a previously unknown institution of God's people which would exist alongside but independently of Israel. Rather, like other Judean authors of the period, he acknowledges the Torah as the binding instruction for proper life. He establishes halachic norms and simultaneously criticizes the opponents for their unauthorized and flawed interpretations of the Torah. Remaining deeply rooted in Judaism, Paul offers his perspective on key halachic issues of his times. According to Paul's halacha, Gentile followers of Jesus have entered the covenant of Israel. Through the sacrifice of the Messiah, they have become fellow heirs, sharing the same rights and obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakub. We will transition immediately to Janelle Peters.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you to everyone for inviting me. I'm so honored to be among so many great Pauline scholars. And I think Jason Staples' daughter has just escaped her reading perch, but it was very admirable how long she spent reading her book. Okay, so when we're thinking of Paul within Judaism, everyone has a particular purchase in this enterprise. I grew up Catholic in Los Angeles, and I studied with a number of Jewish scholars, including David Goodblatt, an Orthodox Jewish scholar who nearly had a heart attack when I suggested that we study a comparison of the crucifixion accounts in the gospel. And so he diverted me to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I do take the project of Paul within Judaism very seriously. And I would see sort of the agenda that I would have as respecting the text and the historical figures as others, as Kathy mentioned, through critical literary historical scholarship, and then acknowledging the diversity, intersections, and multiplicity of religious traditions, both in the past and in the present. And then last but not least, honoring the Jewish origins of the Jesus movement and early Christianity as a way of making amends for historical anti-Semitism. Okay, so I do have one small contribution in Michael Bird's Paul Within Judaism tome that came out with Moore Seebeck. He suggested that I do synagogues, and immediately I said, oh yes, and Paul loves them. And as Jason mentioned, immediately Michael said, but he gets beaten up in them quite frequently. So I agree that he does keep coming back for more. I do that sometimes with my own religious tradition, as I'm sure we all do. And it does appear that in Paul's circles, most of his associates and then also his rivals, his frenemies, as it were, are Jewish or Judaizers. So there's Peter, who is the apostle, obviously, to the Jewish followers of Jesus. And then Paul gets to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Peter prefers to keep kosher. The Judaizers who appear in Galatians advocate for circumcision. Paul, of course, is not for circumcision because it's painful. We have different associates that Paul has being Jewish. So it appears that his circle, his cohorts is very Jewish, and his interlocutors, his Moriartys to his Sherlock Holmes are very Jewish as well. Okay, so then the question becomes, Paul appears to be fairly Jewish as he was raised, but how is he practicing his Judaism, and is his circle actually propelling him to be more Jewish than maybe he would be if he were left on his own, although he's with these people in the first place, so maybe he's just very Jewish.
Now, would you mind starting the slideshow so we can see it in full screen for
Oh,
the
sure.
viewers? Thank you. Sorry about the interruption.
Can you still see it?
Yeah, now that's much better. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So we also have this epistolary audience, as has been mentioned several times before. For the epistolary audience, they appear to enjoy Jewish references and references to Israel. So there again, you have a marker of Jewish practice, although it's difficult to essentialize any religion and say that there are certain key markers that must be present in order for a religion to be identified as such. And then lastly, I guess I would point to, besides the fact that Paul is running around with a number of Jewish people, and he seems to be arguing on, what constitutes Jewishness, which sort of indicates a certain investment. Does he do this too much? Like, why does he keep bringing his Jewishness up? Do we have some sort of inter-Jewish discussion going on? There's definitely an aspect of Paul within Judaism, but given the fact that he does have to adduce his credentials, what does that actually mean for how he is perceived in being Jewish? Okay. If we turn to looking at the communities to which he goes and writes, we can say that obviously scholars have found that these communities are very pure, and that could be a marker of Jewishness. So the ethical separation on which Paul insists could be an indication that these communities are more Jewish, because we know that a number of Jewish texts and communities seem to have practiced purity regulations in order to express their faith. Okay, so obviously Adela Collins points to the incestuous man who gets expelled in 1 Corinthians 5. Sexual immorality of many kinds is something that is attacked by Paul. And one could argue that in many instances, this is not simply creating a purity condition, but it's also creating a more ethical and just living situation. We also have Karen Zetterholm, who has done much more work on Paul within Judaism than I have. And she has done a number of things, including comparing Jubilees to Paul in terms of purity. So again, we would have an endorsement of the purity of Paul's communities. We also have multiple references by Paul to angels, and presumably these angels are Jewish. I remember David Goodblatt was particularly interested in Persian angelology coming over into Jewish practice in the Second Temple, and then later, of course. So with the angels in the community, of course, we have angels in Qumran, as Carol Newsom has written, extensively. But we have a broader angelic tradition, Tobit, and so forth. So these angels are probably Jewish, and that's another indication that we are having Jewish discussions with Paul within Judaism. Sometimes the angels do seem to be going other ways. So there seems to be a complication of the purity, because in some instances, the humans are judging the angels, and in other instances, the angels are watching injustice being carried out on Paul. Okay, and then with the athletic metaphors, you again have this exhortation to further purity, but this sort of expands the horizons of where Paul is looking, because he is not simply looking at the Jewish scriptures, but he is also looking to the broad interest in athletics. So that would be opening up the vista to the Gentiles as well. And one could argue that that's kind of where he goes. He's mostly in Israel. He's from Israel. He wants to graft the Gentiles onto Israel. But in order to make this fair for the Gentiles, he goes to a transcendent level where you just allied the categories. Okay, so that would happen in baptism when people who are following Jesus make their commitment official. They get baptized in the name of Jesus. We see this in the Gospels, of course, but the practice is referred to by Paul in his letters, and he indicates in a number of places that it removes different categorical distinctions. So not all of these categorical distinctions are the same in every list, but for the most part, one might say that enslaved status, gender, and Jewish and Greek dichotomy are what are removed when one is baptized into the name of Jesus. Okay, so that makes one a new creation. One goes back to the creational origins before original sin. And it possibly is an indication that our Jewishness is a little complex, because I don't know that everyone wants to sort of like remove their Jewish or Greek identity. Okay, and then again, with the proxy baptism in 1 Corinthians, we do see the possibility that there is a grace mechanism that can override agency. It's very unclear what this proxy baptism is, but Paul mentions that one should have faith in the resurrection, because why else would we be baptizing the dead unless the resurrection were real? Okay, so there is, some sort of like agency already in baptism. But even there, you could say that there's a little bit of grace, because you don't actually know what you're getting into, since in your whole earthly existence, one has, the experience of seeing through a glass darkly, and thus one does sign on to believing in Jesus, but one goes ever deeper, even with non-proxy baptism. So proxy baptism is related to baptism in that there is an element of grace that goes beyond the agency of the believer in accepting Jesus as their savior. Okay, so in conclusion, for Paul within Judaism, I would say that Paul is well within Jewish circles. And it does appear that these circles are diverse. They have many different interests. They have many different perspectives. Paul does appear to be very educated in a way that some of his associates are not, and that is instructive. One wonders where the other Pauls are, people who are of his educational background, but not necessarily, fully a Sadducee or fully a Pharisee. Paul did train to be a Pharisee, but he doesn't seem to be speaking for the Pharisees when he is writing his letters. So this is perhaps a happy accident of preservation, in that we do get a window into more forms of Judaism during the Second Temple period. One wishes that more texts had been preserved so that we could have even more perspectives. And if we did, we would have other understandings of Judaism existing alongside the multiple understandings of Judaism we already find in the letters of Paul, and then also the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament.
Thank you, Janelle, for that presentation. Unfortunately, something came up at the last minute for Yael Fish, who cannot join us, but she does hope to attend the other remaining sessions. So we're going to move to Paul Sloan, therefore. Paul, go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. Can y'all hear me all right? Y'all can hear me okay? Sorry.
Yes, we
Paul,
can
we
hear
can
you.
hear you.
Sorry, I couldn't hear anybody's response, so I thought that was
You're good.
great. Thanks again, Isaac, Oliver, and everybody who's invited and organized. It really means a lot. I've enjoyed the conversation so far. So here, since I'm kind of so close to the end, I can't imagine that I'll say much that hasn't been said very, very articulately by others. So here I'll agree with Kathy Ahrensberger, who said, what else would it be? What else would Paul's text be if we're talking about Paul's text? I mean, in 1 Corinthians, for example, we see a Jewish author writing to predominantly Gentiles in a community that may contain Jews about questions concerning obedience to Israel's God and Messiah. And the author, Paul, reasons from Torah, exhorts behavior that is consonant with Jewish expectations of Gentiles vis-a-vis sexual morality and idolatry. So the real question is, why would one think that this is a Gentile text or something else, you know? And that's the other thing, is the obverse of Judaism here Gentile, or is the obverse of Judaism Christianity? I mean, we would agree it's not a Gentile text, but are we thinking of Judaism over against Gentilism, you know, or Christianity or something else? So to determine a text as within Judaism or as a Jewish text, as Isaac Oliver has used at times, I think some valuable criteria, but not strictly exhaustive, are to note the sources of authority that are leveraged, the reading strategies that the author employs or operates within, and if the author does say something about him or herself, their self-ascription. So when an author leverages distinctly Jewish authority sources like the Torah or the prophets or writings that were regarded as scriptural by fellow Israelites to advance convictional or hortatory positions that would be considered Jewish by fellow Jews, by which I mean that they would be considered as claims that express a conviction that are based on common sources, then even if those Jews wouldn't share that convictional proposition, the text may still rightly be understood as Jewish. So for example, a Pauline claim that Jesus is the Messiah would be understood as a Jewish claim insofar as he's claiming utilizing a vocabulary common to distinctively Jewish texts and topoi that align Jesus with a promise to David or something along those lines. Then fellow Jews, even if they didn't share that convictional proposition, would still recognize the claim as Jewish. Then with regard to the practices of the author, at least to the degree that they're known, or the practices that the author exhorts, I think you probably have to distinguish those. It again seems you have to rely on self-ascription rather than evaluations of other Jews, Christ adherents or not, for at least two reasons. We very often just simply lack data outside of self-ascription. We don't have a lot of evidence about the way other Jews would have evaluated Paul's Jewishness or his practice out with the synagogue discipline that he mentions. But there, that actually would point to participation or involvement, submission to discipline, as I think it was Sanders who said, you know, discipline implies inclusion. But also, of course, as many have said, that the reason you have to also rely on self-ascription rather than evaluation of others is because the practices that function as boundary limits are neither, in most cases, not universal nor hard-edged. I mean, would Philo's allegorists have thought that they were doing Jewish stuff? I suspect they would, even if they weren't doing it literally. But on those grounds, then, of course, as people have noted in the chat, it opens up a question of how you would then evaluate Origen's, the author Origen, whether he is within Judaism or not, because of he's claiming to be right the spiritual Jew over against the carnal Jew or the fleshly Jew, whatever. So on these grounds, then, though, I think this is an important point. I think this means that readings of Paul that are offered by, say, John Barclay or N.T. Wright would be considered readings that situate Paul within Judaism, given that those authors recognize and claim that Paul remained a Jew and that he acted the way he did and wrote the way he did based on a revelation from Israel's God that forced him not to abandon arguing from his scriptures, but to reevaluate his prior reading of them or what have you. But of course, many Pauline Judaism scholars would not and have not evaluated Wright and Barclay's work as situated within Judaism, despite their own claims that is what they're doing in their own research. This is an interesting little problem we've got ourselves into. So at that point, the utility of the label is a bit questionable, and it serves, like all labels do, to remind that it has a limited but specific heuristic significance, as Nanos pointed out in the beginning, which I agree with. So by 2025, after decades of comparable labels, the label we now use within Judaism, it serves as a heuristic to remind readers that the documents of the New Testament are Jewish texts, in that they're claiming to be an expression of religious convictions that started among Jews and was and remains to be shaped by Jewish sources of authority and a Jewish way of representing the world, especially when you note the centrality of Israel and the peripheral quality, or sometimes non-existent quality, of the non-Israelite nations in a lot of texts. Within our modern context, though, the label within Judaism, when it's referring to the school, it serves as an indicator of what a given modern day scholar thinks about the first generation or two's law adherents. So for example, in my world, if I'm like, when I'm teaching in Houston, Texas, among a bunch of Baptists, first of all, when I tell them Paul and Judaism, they're like, what? But then when I say, well, no, it means X, Y, Z, they're like, oh, so, you know, they're surprised by the law adherence thing. Over against when you go to SBL and you say, oh yeah, well, I read, you know, I think Paul and Judaism is right. You're probably going to be heard as saying that you think there's a continued validity of law observance for fellow Jews. There's lots of other things that are, of course, part of the package of within Judaism, but that seems to be a pretty essentialized one. So that if a scholar were to deny a continuing validity or obligating function of Torah observance in some form, scholars of the within Judaism label would say, well, that's not really what we're doing, you know, I suspect. So I'm really not attached to this label, and again, its utility is I do think it has utility though. And I think it's to broadly prepare a reader for what they'll experience when they're picking up either a New Testament text or a secondary scholarship on it. So much like I want to know the genre of the movie that I'm about to watch, right? If you expect a rom-com, but then the movie is desaturated with color and you start to get a POV cam of a masked man walking slowly toward an unsuspecting victim, you're likely to be confused. So labels shake expectations for what is possible, both in the viewing or in our case, the reading experience. And that means both in terms of when you're reading the text itself, like Romans or whatever for the New Testament, or reading secondary scholarship on it. Now, the point I wish to raise is the way in which the modern schools label within Judaism or as Jewish texts functions, I think rightly, and in a way that Nanos gestured in the beginning, to remind, to defamiliarize readers from certain presuppositions that they might have. In other words, to remind readers that the NT documents are expressions of Jewish patterns of thinking, and they thereby, once you have that conviction or presupposition when you go to read the text, what it gets you is it leaves open the notion that they continue to ascribe a value or even an obliging function to the law's governance. And I'm picking again law's governance or the validity of Torah observance because that seems to be a sticking point for PWJ scholarship. It leaves open the notion that they continue to ascribe a value for ongoing Torah observance or whatever. And again, I mentioned law observance because it's been both an emphasis in the modern school, but also because, of course, it's often presented as a descriptive category of Jews in Second Temple Judaism. So this, to me, has been the greatest value in my own research. So, what if I didn't assume that certain texts must mean what centuries of scholarship has said that they've meant about Torah observance of either Jesus, the apostles, or the earliest adherents? If I assume a certain reading, if I just assume that, well, we know that they got rid of Torah observance for whatever reason, then it's impossible to see it otherwise. That does, my point is not to adopt a sort of a convictional stance that, well, the New Testament must work within a Torah observant reading, so I'm just gonna make it work. But my point is that leaving the question open allows for insights that we might just not be able to see otherwise. And that's the value of the label itself. I think it does that work for readers. And I think it's been the utility for me, so that when I get to certain texts, I don't assume, well, this doesn't mean X, Y, Z, and then it leaves open for insights that you might not have otherwise been able to see because you're patient and you then can compare what you're reading to all the kind of other literature that's out there, opening the door to comparison with other halakha of the period. Isaac, am I at time?
Yes, unfortunately so. But thank you for that. We're going to go last but not least to Giulio Mariotti.
Here I am. Thank you for this invitation, Isaac and Gabriele. Thank you, Pierluigi, for recalling our recent works. And Paul wrote a time when there were no other available categories besides Jew or Gentile. And Paul, despite his originality, remains truly Jewish. What we needed to develop, in my view, is an understanding of how Paul's conception of time changed. If we look at 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul clearly states that he expects to be alive at the Lord's return. In this regard, the existential dimension of someone who sees the end before them shouldn't be underestimated in our research. On the road to Damascus, as he recounts in Galatians, he receives a revelation, what he shows as a prophetic calling to the nations. From that moment on, Paul lives in the time between the two parousia, a time meant to prepare for the eschatological full inclusion of Israel. His embrace of an apocalyptic worldview begins with this revelation, the recognition that the solution to the problem of evil, clearly central to his human experience, is found in the risen Messiah. This revelation doesn't remove him from Judaism, but rather reposition him within it. It's the time that has become short or folded up like 1 Corinthians, requiring a different posture. With the end now in sight, and that end bringing salvation, everything takes on a new meaning. Jews and Gentiles are now part of communities that represent all Israel, Romans 11. On this point, Jason Staple was right when he spoke of Paul operating within Israel. At the same time, if Paul with his community is actively preparing for the whole Israel, then he is fully a part of the pluralistic Judaism of the first century. In other words, it stands within Judaism. As Katie R. Spenger once pointed out, unlike the animal apocalypse, Paul simply locates himself at a different point on the eschatological timeline. His shift is primarily temporal, not social or religious. Paul repositions his vision in the time between the ages, rather than stepping outside the boundaries of Judaism. What is new is the time, not religion. When in 1 Thessalonians 5 he speaks of the second parousia coming like birth pangs, he sees the current moment as a gestational. Conception has already taken place, the first parousia, and the birth, the second parousia, is yet to come. He understands himself as living in the pregnancy-like phase, preparing the communities, as in Galatians 4:19, where he likens himself to a woman in labor. His missionary work, as Paula Fredrickson has emphasized, is shaped by the eschatological urgency. Hence, I suggest 2 keys to understanding Paul. First, his conception of time, which reframes traditional frameworks and offers a crucial interpretive lens for his letters. And second, his emphasis on weakness. The awareness of human frailty may well be what brought him into contact with apocalyptic thought in the first place. It's from this weakness that emerges the need to find a solution to the problem of evil, a solution he finds in the risen Messiah, Jesus. Paul's problem then wasn't the law, but the evil he experienced even through what he calls weakness. One striking fact remains. How many other writings do we possess from Second Temple Jews who had recognized the Messiah? It's the earliest extant written testimony of a Jew who recognized Jesus as the Messiah. It becomes, in a sense, the model for something entirely new, something whose future trajectory was unknown. Also, we can ask how flexible the boundaries of first century Judaism were, but we cannot define that abstractly. They were defined by the Jews living in that era. Paul proposes something that had never happened before. He is a first century apocalyptic and messianic Jew, and his writings show us what that means. Provocatively, we might ask, who are we to say who counted as Jewish or not, when Paul himself always identifies as a Jew? This may sound ideological, But if we consider that at Paul's death, there was still no parting of the ways, no option to be anything other than Jewish or Gentile, then the eschatological Israel Paul envisions clearly remains inside the Judaism. In this sense, Paul himself becomes the criterion of Jewish belonging. When we look at interpretations of Paul developed after his death, they often lose the urgency of his apocalyptic expectation. These later interpreters were facing entirely different challenges, defining orthodoxy, for instance, in contrast to emerging heresies. It was precisely in this period that, according to Paget, a supersessionist model became attractive for Christianity. It was this trend of early Christianity, the one that came to dominate. It gave rise to what Gabriele and I, in our book, call the invention of anti-Jewish Paul. To read Paul within Judaism, then, is to return him to his vital context and to recognize how later Christian tradition sometimes overlaid his writings with layers of interpretation, occasionally using them as weapons either against Jews or in support of exclusivist soteriologies. We should also ask what happens when Paul is no longer read as part of an intra-Jewish or even intra-Christian debate. In the dialogue with Trifo, Justin Martyr interprets the story of Abraham, misrepresenting Paul's reference in Romans 4. For Paul, the story of Abraham demonstrates that both Jew and Gentile share the same status before God through faith in their common Father. However, Justin utilizes this narrative to support his supersessionist anti-Jewish vision. Tertullian calling Paul the destructor of Judaism in its polemic against Marcion. Tertullian presents Judaism as a reality external to Christianity, going beyond what Paul stated. Even Augustine, perhaps the figure who most closely identifies with Paul the man, doesn't share Paul's eschatological urgency, reading Paul outside Judaism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Giulio. So I suggest, and I'm looking here for Gabriele, maybe we take a 5-minute break, and then we will come back, and the remainder of the time will be dedicated to discussion. So 5-minute break. Let's convene, I guess, at 12:03. It's an odd way of saying time, p.m. Eastern time. See you soon.
Crispin, good job. That was me, Paul Sloan. You're muted, but
yeah, thank you, Paul.
yeah, that was fun to listen to.
Oh,
Very
good.
clear.
Yeah, and yours was great too.
Well,
yeah.
You had to say that.
Well, it was yours, and there are certain types of speaker that I can easily listen to. Yours and Jason were much the easiest to enjoyable to listen to.
Well, thanks. I really appreciate all the comments. Yeah.
Pretty mad job there, Paul.
Pretty what?
Pretty mad job there.
Yeah,
Paul.
that's right. Thank you. I needed that. After Crispin's compliment, I needed you to tell me. All right, I'm gonna go get some water.
Yeah. See you soon.
All right. It is 12:03 Eastern Time. There are many things we can talk about. I'm sure we can discuss Paul Le Dorvador from generation to generation. We will have also a recap tomorrow, as Gabriele mentioned, brought to us by Paula Fredrickson, and an opportunity to informally chat as well before we do the discussion on Mark proper. We do want to give opportunity for the panelists to interact with each other. We can also bring some of the participants that are attending if need be. But I'm going to allow Gabriele to offer a few comments if you wish before we then interact with one another.
Yes, just briefly. I listened to all the speakers very carefully. It was a very interesting discussion. And you will be pleased that more than 200 people have listened to you for 2 hours. So it's very important. I mean, I think the discussion is very important. My general impression is this. The within Judaism label is not perfect. I agree perfectly with Mark and also Paul and others. I mean, it's not, and Jason, no, I don't see him now. This is not a perfect label. Maybe some other labels could be better. I mean, I remember the discussion we had in January within Israel, within the religion of Israel, within the diversity of the religion of Israel in the first century. So, but we have to move on. I mean, the first thing that Nanos said at the beginning, we have to move on from the discussion on the label itself to the intention that we have using this label. Because at the end, what we want to say is a simple fact that in order to understand Paul, we have to read his figure within the diverse world of the religion of Israel in the first century. In this sense, it's a very short, effective label that to a certain extent force people to rethink traditional ways in which Paul was read as an apostate, as the destroyer of Judaism, as the one that converted from Judaism to another religion. Obviously, saying that Paul was Jewish and using the within Judaism label, we want to be against these ideas that are traditional, are very well rooted, and are still very, very influential. So, second point is, for me, the most important thing is not the within Judaism label, is what comes next. In the sense that the real problem is what kind of Jew Paul was. Because Paul was a very complex character. I mean, he grew up in a Jewish Hellenistic environment. He joined the Pharisaic group. We know from the Acts that at a certain point he also served the high priest of Jerusalem. So he had some contact with the Sadducees. On the other hand, many of us are emphasizing the strong apocalyptic ideas that are in Paul. So in this sense, Paul is also a very important source for our understanding of Second Temple Judaism. And at the end, or if you want, an important source for understanding of the religion of Israel during the Second Temple period. And on the other hand, we need to understand what happened to Paul when he joined the Jesus movement. He did not go outside of Judaism. He did not become an apostate. Paul was born, lived, and died a Jew, but he certainly changed his way of understanding Judaism, understanding the religion of Israel. And in this sense, it's important to ask ourselves what kind of ideas he joined, what kind of emphasis he had in the moment when he became a follower of Jesus. But I think that the great merit of the within Judaism label is to force us to reject the idea of Paul as somebody that went out, left, abandoned Judaism and began criticizing Judaism from outside. I think that the great merit of this label is for us to understand that Paul, although being a very original thinker and not just an ordinary Jew as everybody else, he remained within the boundaries of the religion of Israel of the first century. So I think at the end this is the main point of our discussion. I mean, and we have to thank those scholars that have emphasized this label to make us understand the importance of not only of reading Paul in relation to Judaism, but as part of the religion of Israel of the second temple.
Thank you, Gabriele. Yeah, so we're going to open the floor here for some exciting discussion. And as a chair, I'm going to selfishly also just toss a couple of questions there to take advantage of all the wisdom, expertise that is available to us here today. Two passages or reference points that I saw come up a lot in the discussion was 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 to 15. I mean, Kathy, unfortunately, she had to withdraw because of an urgent matter, and so it's not with us right now, but did allude to this so-called anti-Semitic comma in at the end of verse 14 in the English, depending on how you punctuate that. But how do you, anyone here who wants to chime in, this does keep me up at night, comma or no comma. What bothers me is verse 15. If we're talking about this Paul within Judaism stuff, if this is Paul speaking, right, there is the possibility of interpolation here, who killed both the Lord Jesus, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard, and the prophets, and drove us out, they displease God and oppose everyone. You know, that language of opposing everyone is what I'd be curious to hear from folks, any kind of reaction from that. If this is just Judeans in Judea, I guess that minimizes the problem. Nevertheless, this sounds for me like a bit Paul accusing at least some Jews of being misanthropic, which is more of a pagan sounding discourse, someone like Seneca or Tacitus, I don't know. So that's one question. The other one is the lashes came up a lot here, 5 times. Why did Paul undergo the 40 minus 1 lashes? So those are my 2 questions. No one has to immediately answer them. We also want to provide opportunities here for some back and forth. Pierluigi, your virtual hand is raised, so we'll let you begin.
Yes, only concerning the first question, the first part of the question, you are absolutely right. That was misanthropic, that the misanthropy, the usual accusation against Jews who are misanthropic, so generally is held by pagan authors against Jews. And by the way, what intrigues me, it's the end of verse 15. If I remember well, finally the reward, or finally the punishment have fallen on them. But what kind of punishment, what kind of reward, what kind of disaster has fallen on them? when Paul was writing the first epistle to the Thessalonians, at the beginning of the 50s, 51 perhaps, from Corinth. So it doesn't make any sense. To me, clearly, these two verses are an interpolation, are a late interpolation after the destruction of the temple. So it's a malevolent interpolation, anti-Jewish interpolation, very late. And that's the easiest, the simplest solution. But I know that a lot of New Testamentalists and philologists don't like that, because as a principle, they don't like to have interpolation in the New Testament text. To me, there is no problem. It's an interpolation. So as for the second point, it's another problem. So I let other colleagues to reply to that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Pierluigi. Yeah. Of course, one of the issues is we don't have manuscripts, right, without those verses, to my knowledge, unless somebody else has come up with new information on that. But
even in Marcion, I believe it's present even in Marcion. There is in the quotation from Marcion, there is something like that, if I remember.
Okay.
So it's an old interpolation.
Interpolation, then perhaps. Yes, Mark Nanos. Your hand is raised.
Hitting the wrong buttons. So yeah, I think this is very interesting. I have not done my own deep translation work required on this. Couple of points. One is, well, we don't have any manuscripts for a couple hundred years. So once we get into that, I think we can't really talk about Paul. And so I just don't bother with it too much. But I do think part of the project of retranslating Paul requires the kind of expertise to reconsider what manuscript preferences have been made, because those are also interpretations of the available options. But I think about this particular passage, actually the two go together rather well, in my view. I think that Paul had problems with his fellow Jews in synagogues, where I think his subgroups took place or were understood to be a part of, because of the social changes that were being made for non-Jews who were not proselytes and welcome as friends, and maybe even out-Jewing all the Jews. But there was a distinction that he was blurring that creates just the kind of social policies we'd expect, where if a Catholic priest started telling non-Catholics who were better Catholics than others that they could take the host and so on, you would have this kind of problem. So I don't think it's because he doesn't observe Torah, is that his interpretation creates social problems for those who don't agree about his interpretation, and not just theological problems. And so he would be disciplined, try to bring him into compliance with the prevailing norms of the larger Jewish community. I think it actually argues for it on several levels. And I think if you just stopped from getting your 39 lashes, you'd be pissed off. And it wouldn't surprise me that you would use this kind of language. Pissed off, I think, is good theological jargon, isn't it? And I think, gosh, I'm pretty pissed off when people just insult me or ignore my work. So I can't imagine what I'd feel like if somebody beat me up because of my views about how Gentiles fit or don't fit or who they are. And so I'm not that troubled by it. And I also notice in this phrase, the reason I was a little delayed is to look back at the text, which happens to be on my computer instead of beside me, that, it's about what he's mad about is that they're preventing him from talking to these Gentiles about how they can be restored to God. It's not just an open-ended. He's actually, this fits. It all kind of, to me, fits together as a guy who was a part of some kind of maybe weird Pharisaic group that was already incorporating non-Jews by proselyte transformation. He's convinced now that that's not appropriate, but he's still carrying on that Pharisaic weird subgroup idea to incorporate them, but not as part of Israel. And so that's what I think makes sense of that kind of aggressive polemic in the moment. Maybe he wrote this letter right when he just got done, got up off the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Jakub.
Yes, regarding the first question, I think that this verse in Thessalonians might show us that in the New Testament texts, Judaioi does not always mean, does not always refer merely to a biological descent or race, if you will, because I mean it includes it, but it's not just this. Paul himself does not seem to call himself a Judean too often in the New Testament in his letters. I think it's only one time in Galatians 2:15 that he uses Judaioi, and it is not clear if it's his own statement or if he is repeating statements of other people. And he calls himself an Israelite, Hebrew as well, from the tribe of Benjamin in Philippians. So I think that Paul did contest some aspects of the Judean identity. And that's also how I read Galatians 1:13 and 14 when Paul says about Judaismos. I mean, like, it's not clear what the Judaismos means there. It's, I think, the third or fourth time that it appears in the literature at all. So we need to be careful when we translate it as Judaism. And certainly, I think it does not mean Torah practice or the Jewish way of life. I think that Paul is speaking there about some aspects of Judean identity of the Second Temple period that he viewed as problematic, especially this idea of strict separation from the Gentiles. And I think one helpful way to explain this, the Thessalonians verse, is the idea brought up by Dan Boyarin, who claimed in one article that Judaioi is like it's not all Jews or even all Israelites of the Second Temple period, but some kind of elites that emerged from the community of Ezra, the elites that came back from Babylon and who sort of took over the religious discourse in the Second Temple period. So I would say that Paul is using here the Judaioi in this way, because otherwise he would be saying that if it was biological descendants, he would be speaking about himself, that he's responsible for what happened to Jesus. And I think that he's not saying this, and he's not saying that all biological descendants of Jacob are responsible for that. But I think he's pointing to some kind of establishment or some kind of elites that are in some way, according to Paul, responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. And I think that's one of the ways we could try to explain it. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's my idea.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. We have two other hands raised, Jason and Paul. So I'll let you go ahead. Jason first.
So, as I said before, I've actually put this in print in that I'm very much a supporter of eliminating the comma. I think grammatically there's no reason not to read hupoton Judaion ton kai ton kurion as anything other than a restrictive clause. The other thing is, and several people have made this observation before, is that those verses, he's already talking about, like everyone that he's talking about in that verse, God's churches in Christ Jesus, or God's ecclesia in Christ Jesus that are in Judea, those are all Jews too, right? Everybody he's talking about in that verse are Jews. And so then he says, and but they were, you're suffering the same thing from your own fellow countrymen as they did from, hupoton Judaion tone. And when you get that, you would expect the tone to be restrictive, since everybody in the clause in the prior discussion is already Jewish. So now he's telling you which Jews they were persecuted by, and it happens to be the same people that he says persecuted Jesus and the prophets. So that's a whole different thing. I think that this has to be restrictive and referring to a specific subgroup. The grammar supports that reading, and just in terms of sense, that makes sense. Now, I don't think that this is an interpolation. Yes, the earliest readings of this are in later manuscripts, but that's true of everything that we have. And we don't have good early manuscripts that don't have this verse. So I don't think that there's a really good argument that this is an interpolation. And I'm not persuaded by the idea that saying, well, they haven't suffered anything. They haven't suffered 70 yet. But we see in First Thessalonians, Paul is expecting an apocalyptic, eschatological event that he sees as, and he says by the word of the Lord, he's alluding to Jesus' teaching, I think, in that phrase. If Paul's aware that Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple, which I think is one thing, I agree with Sanders that's one thing that we can very likely associate with the historical Jesus, is that Jesus made some sort of demonstration and proclaimed that the temple would be destroyed. Then for Paul, that was now the die was cast. Like, that's going to happen. Those people and the whole infrastructure and everything that led to this, that's all going down now because of what happened with like, they've brought that blood on their heads. Here's how this is going to go. But is that about Jews writ large? Of course not. No, that's about the Jews who did this, right? And that's why that comma should be removed. The verse break, I think, is really the reason that most people have read this the way that it is so long. If we didn't have this verse divided into 14 and 15, any Greek reader is just going to go through this and read this as a restrictive clause, I think. But the verse divisions, I think, are deceptive. And that gets back to Mark's point, and actually builds on it. It's not just about translation. It's also about recognizing where things as simple as, verse divisions, which are not original to the text, may prejudice the way that we read the text. And once we get that out of there, I think it's entirely coherent with the rest of the letter. I think it's coherent with what Paul says in Romans 10 about specific people who sought their own righteousness or their own justness or whatever, and his argument there. I think there's a lot there that fits with what Paul thinks, but I don't think that he thinks that this is the case for Jews writ large. I think that this must be read as a restrictive clause. And I will also just attest to my agreement, even though I wasn't in the room. I had to make some lunch for my kids. I had my headphones in, but I want to express my agreement with the couple people, Gabriella and also others who've commented that it's less about the label and more about the sort of the payoff of saying, if we're talking about Paul within Judaism, I do think that the biggest service that may do for us is getting away from a Paul converted to something else model, that he saw himself as leaving the theological framework and notion of peoplehood that he lived with before for something else. For you get the new perspective model, which I think is mistaken. That he resists, for example, Jewish ethnocentrism or racism and embraces some sort of universalism, and I just don't see that. And I do think that the attention to the ethnic underpinnings of Paul's world and then his continued participation in that has been one of the real strong suits of Paul within Judaism work so far. So I yield the balance of my time to Paul Sloan.
All right. Thank you for that. Yes, Paul, go ahead.
I'll just make a really brief comment. You had mentioned, Isaac, the misanthropic comment. This is a typical thing, right? And of course, that's the case. I mean, I would suspect, though, it's also it seems to be extant in some Dead Sea documents in which they'll deeply heated, but nonetheless intramural rhetoric that would ascribe to others, particularly all these bad activities that they don't like, and they'll be judged for it. Of course, I'm thinking particularly of I only have the English in front of me. Sorry, I left my scrolls in another spot in my office. But 4Q169, the Nahum Pesher, its interpretation concerns those looking for easy interpretations, whose evil deeds will be exposed to all Israel in the final time. Many will fathom their sin. They will hate them and loathe them for their reprehensible arrogance, etc. They've misdirected all these people. That seems to be an intramural criticism, in which one Jewish group is saying this about another, that they've done all these terrible things and people will hate them for it and all that sort of stuff. And we can then have our own moral evaluations about the nature of this rhetoric, whether it's good to use or not. But it goes back to the label. Once, if you're working with the assumption that this is an intramural and therefore within Judaism type thing, it's a distinct. It functions rhetorically differently than when that kind of rhetoric occurs in subsequent centuries, when it becomes, rather than an intramural thing, an adverse Judaism type thing. And as everybody knows, intramural criticism is heard differently by insiders themselves. I can speak a certain way to, insiders in my group that I can't to people who are outside of the group. I haven't earned the right, as it were, to speak that certain way. Again, that's a distinct question than our moral evaluations of that type of rhetoric. But situating it within that would both show that there's evidence of that kind of rhetoric, but also it would help us categorize it differently, I think.
Thanks for that. I mean, I'm still wondering, I guess we could spend a whole session just on this comma. I mean, granted that it's restrictive, etc. We still have that phrase, passing tois anthropos, they oppose all human beings. It nags me a little bit. And I know Pierluigi did ask, what do you make of the aorist? I think that question was addressed to you, Jason, at the end of 216, Eftasten Erpatus. It seems it has come. Now, maybe that's just what the Jews have been cut off, according to Paul, who haven't accepted Jesus or have opposed the Jesus movement. But some comments here, if we're looking at the chat, which I can't completely attend to as the chair, pointing out that might be a 70 issue. Turning to Bob, and also maybe thinking of one of the questions that Robert brought up, what do we make as panelists about the letter to the Romans, which Robert in his presentation did point out some unique features there. It'd be interesting to hear responses to that. But before that question is addressed, Robert, you had your hand raised, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Isaac. Excuse me. Well, just one more thing to add to the 1 Thessalonians 2 issue is it also seems to me that Paul might be falling back on a prophetic idiom just because of how severe some of the judgments against Israel or Judea are couched in the Old Testament prophets and other people who are sort of assuming a position to sort of speak on behalf of God and announcing judgment. It seems that some of that rhetoric is over the top already in the Hebrew Bible. And so I wonder if that might be going on a little bit as well. As far as the lashes go, if we're asking why Paul would keep submitting, that I don't know. But if we're asking why did he keep getting beaten, I wonder if the book of Acts can help us out a little bit, particularly in chapter 21. I think you pointed out, and other people have pointed out, how Paul is rendered as, in the book of Acts, as a thoroughly Torah observant character who's completely in line with the Jewish temple and Jerusalem and the feast, etc. But apparently, almost out of the blue, he's accused, in the words of James passing this on, and of the rioters in chapter 21, this is verses 21 and 28, of rejecting circumcision, of forsaking the customs and the law, of teaching against the temple. And whatever Paul said, it seems to me that he said, so let me back up a minute. This seems to have no purchase within the narrative of the book of Acts. Luke, or the author, simply introduces this almost out of the blue. And it seems to me that's a very strong indication that the author knows that these are the criticisms that are in the air about Paul. And so if that's the case, the people who are making these accusations, it might be intramural from our perspective, but they seem to think that Paul is not, he's betrayed the people. himself. And so I think sometimes, he might not have apostatized from his perspective, but it does seem to be the case that there were contemporaries of his who think that he did, and kept trying to enforce that with that judgment, that evaluation with the synagogue discipline.
Yes, thanks for sharing that, Robert. So I don't know if there are responses from the panelists or even from the attendees. What are our possibilities here for that? I'd also be curious because one of the items that I brought up in the introduction is the status of the Gentiles, right, in Paul's thought. And so, for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, I think, chapter 10, excuse me, verse 1, where Paul seems to be referring to our fathers in passing as he's addressing a presumably Gentile audience. Are the Gentiles, what is their status vis-a-vis Israel, if we're thinking of this verse? Is this something that even if Paul related to the Gentiles in Christ only as children of Abraham, but nevertheless claiming that they are partakers in the promises made to Abraham, would that have been something that would have proved controversial to other Jews who, for them, Jesus, as far as they knew, was a crucified Jew? End of the matter. How can you say that they can partake in the promises that were given to our fathers? I don't know if there's some interaction with those kind of questions, but it is one of these items that is important for the Paul within Judaism perspective, so-called, the status of the Gentiles.
Mark, fica.
Yes, go ahead, Mark.
Yes, my understanding of Galatians, especially towards the end of it, where he speaks about those who don't want to be contested for the cross of Christ, revolves around this kind of social issue. I think most Jews would put it somewhat like you just did, Isaac, that it's kind of a non sequitur. I can sympathize this Jewish guy that the Romans murdered. But what does that have to do with what's happening in our little synagogue here in Galatia? You are making, you are appealing to this to make propositional claims about changing the social order here. And that disrupts our community. And by the way, this guy's not even here anymore. Maybe you misunderstood him. Maybe he's really Meshuggah, and you ought to move on. But here's what we have. This is the convention we have in place to make this work socially. That to me seems like the kind of disruption. And so for me, they're not probably fellow Christ followers or anything to do with the Jerusalem church or anything. They're just local Jews reacting to something new that's been introduced that is inscrutable to them as a justification, legitimation for these non-Jews' expectations. I don't know if that is exactly a direct answer, but I think it's relevant to the point.
Yes, Jakub.
Yes, I'd like to connect this to the previous question because, like, according to my understanding, I think I'm probably in a minority, but I think Paul viewed his Gentiles as Israelites by the sacrifice of Yeshua, the sacrifice of Jesus, and I think that was his view, and he shows this by using the vocabulary. He speaks about ecclesiae, that is a Jewish way of framing things. This is the word that is used in Septuagint also for the congregation of Israel. He uses the sons of Abraham, which is also in all the texts, as I mentioned, it always means Israelites. But also when you look at this speech of Paul in Jerusalem in Acts, this is later reception of Paul, but I think it's connected and it supports this argument. The Jerusalemites, they listen to Paul throughout his speech, and he mentions that Jesus spoke to him from heaven and they still listen. And this is quite a claim, right? That somebody speaks to you from heaven and makes you blind, and they were not offended by this, apparently. But when Paul said that Jesus sent him to Gentiles, now they decided to stone him because a fellow like this does not deserve to live. So what gave Paul problems that eventually led to his death, apparently, is that he went to Gentiles. And if you would be going to Gentiles just to have them stay Gentiles, I don't think this would provoke a controversy. But like claiming that these Gentiles can become Israelites by the sacrifice of some Judean martyr that died a few years ago, this was a big claim, and it would, yeah, as Mark Nanos also said, this was, in general, this would destroy the social order. And I think this was a social problem in the first place, and some groups were trying to resolve this in various ways. And Paul was just going his way, and he didn't care that much about social order. He preached that these Gentiles enter the covenant of Israel by the sacrifice of Jesus, and this is what ultimately caused him trouble. So I think that this is what happens in Paul's letters, and there's a confirmation in a later account of Acts. After so many years, Paul is still remembered as a Torah observant Jew and somebody who created a social problem dealing with admission of Gentiles into the covenant of Israel.
Is there like some kind of consensus that the panelists feel is emerging from today's discussion? I don't know. The saying is 3 Paul scholars, 4 opinions, or is it 2 Paul scholars, 3 opinions? I don't know. There might be multiple opinions about that saying. But do we see any kind of advancement being made with the discussion on Paul within Judaism? Paul?
Sorry, accident.
Oh, okay. Are there any like broad lines of agreement, any things that we could say, okay, we do agree that, this is Paul, a Jew. I suppose there might be some items still of controversy. Gentile status seems to be one of them, right? Are the Gentiles Israelites? Some would say yes, others would say no. They are children of Abraham, perhaps, but not children of Jacob. There's a case to be made for that point. But Paul's a Jew. Maybe that is the statement that we all agree on, but that's not saying much, perhaps. Even if we're looking at generations beforehand, this is maybe something rather revolutionary, finally, if we look at the generations before that set Pauline Christianity in opposition to Jewish Christianity, for example. We've made some progress there by including Paul within the Jewish sphere rather than in opposition to the Jewish sphere. But I'm wondering if there's some other issues where there might be agreement, or whether, there's still points of division besides the Gentile, the status of the Gentiles. Torah observance, I think, is the other main issue that continues to remain, within the debate here. Mark, I don't know if your hand is raised again to
Yes, it is.
address some of these. Okay, yes, go ahead.
Yes, it is. I did want to come in. I'd like to speak to what you just asked, but I did want to come in on the last statement. And I also saw something briefly in the chat that provoked me to say, for me, when we talk about this as intra and inter-Jewish and all the hostility it can have, I actually think the Qumran documents are helpful in that community. If this is in the family, and I think Paul Sloan's made this point too, or someone did, that it's proper point that within the family you can say things, and in America, African Americans are entitled to say things that the rest of us aren't entitled to say. And I think that actually can place a person. It betrays this self-identification, but also the expectations of the recipient's expectations of you, into how you'd be received. And I think that it's important to recognize that this does not mean you're excluded from the family. You're excluding the other person from the family, that you think the covenant, these people are no longer Israel, as Romans 9:6 is usually read, and so on. I don't think it means that at all. In fact, It means that you are arguing and trying to bring each other into conformity with what you think is correct, the best way to do it, or the only way God wants it to be done if you're that arrogant, which most of them seem to be. So I don't think that that it needs to go down the direction it usually does. And I think that here the comments that Paul makes in Galatians, as well as Romans 11 especially, are relevant. He doesn't think his fellow Israelites are outside of the covenant. He thinks they're in some kind of temporary estrangement, those that aren't agreeing, and that this is somehow part of God's plan, and it's all going to come together. So he's like arguing for the sibling who is in timeout and can't have ice cream with all the rest of us, but it's not the same as that they're outside the family. And I think this is a really significant part of trying to come together on what we're talking about with Paul within Judaism. And then I think the point you've raised, Isaac, the one that I would like to speak to briefly is, to me, and you know this if you know my work, and if you've heard me speak for some 30 years, it's not enough to talk about Judaism, and you have to talk about Torah. And then, of course, the pushback is, what do you mean by Torah, everybody? Well, I mean Torah the way Paul talking about it, stuff like what you eat, what calendar you observe, how you interact with each other, the authority of the Pentateuch, disputing whether a proselyte conversion is in the Pentateuch, and therefore whether it's an appropriate nomos and so on to apply. So I think that that's actually a critical point that things have to move towards. And I think the Paul within Judaism movement will splinter over this topic. I think that there's those who want to make Torah so broad that, well, heck, a person like myself looks like a real Torah observant Jew, which is not what I'm talking about with Paul. He's not a reform type of Jew, in my view, of what comes out of his rhetoric. And I think that's a relevant point for getting at what kind of Judaism we're talking about. I think it's a form of Pharisaic oriented Judaism. And I think that's relevant for us as we move along to get, yeah, it's fine. There's going to be all kinds of views about that. But in the one that I'm talking about, the issue, and it's not rabbinic Torah yet, of course, but Pharisaic, whatever that means. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes, Jason.
So I'm afraid I have to disagree with Mark on at least one detail here, and that's that. I mean, I fully agree with the point about, things get said within families that you just wouldn't say to a stranger, or at least you shouldn't say to a stranger, right? But you made the point. Now I'm going to try not to misquote you here, but you made the point that when they're saying it within the family, they're still in the family. It's not like they're outside the family. But the thing is, when you read like 4Q Pesher Nachum, 4Q 179, that's precisely what they're saying. Actually, they're saying you guys are not going to be in the family anymore. They're saying, dad's disinheriting you. You're not in the family anymore. You're not in the will. That strikes me as something a little bit different than sort of how you're characterizing that, in that, yes, this is at least, and again, I'm talking about specifically about Pesher Nachum here. And I think we could debate its applicability to Paul on this specific matter, but we should be careful not to presume that since it's intramural or intrafamilial, that it therefore is like, well, we'll all get back at the dinner table and we'll be able to break bread together and we're all still part of the same family. There's a certain point where, no, you're disowned. You're not part of this family anymore. And that's a real practical, viable thing, particularly in the ancient world. And that seems to be the argument that at least is being made at Qumran, that the bulk of y'all aren't even part of Israel anymore and you don't even know it, which is actually what, say, that critique goes all the way back to Hosea, right? You are lo ami. You're not my people. You are illegitimate children. You're running around thinking you're the people of God, but you're not actually in the covenant at all. And I'm going to scatter. And like that critique, Hosea is within the people. He's critiquing his own countrymen, and he says that. And that seems to be a fundamentally different thing than this is just an intramural critique, and I'm not arguing for something, you know, that you're out or whatever. No, this is you're out. And I think that point we have to take seriously, as uncomfortable as that is, and as inconvenient as that is to what we might want these texts to say. And you know, I think I might make the case that we should want these texts to say in certain of these cases. They don't always say what we want them to say. And this might be one of those cases.
Jason, however, there is a difference between saying I'm in and I think that you are out, or saying I'm out and I'm criticizing you. Okay, so I think this is a big difference.
Fully agree. Fully agree.
Big difference, because this is the same thing that we, as you say, that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, we are members of a family that say you are no longer a member of a family. Okay, so you are doing a critique from the family. Okay, the problem that we have, Christianity was born, the Jesus movement was born as a criticism within the family, okay, and then ended into a bunch of people that were criticizing the Jews from outside. So, and so our problem studying Paul is to what stage Paul still belongs. And I think that he still belongs to the first stage. He still belongs to the stage in which Paul, from the family, is also criticizing some other Jews, and even saying, if you like, you are no longer part of a family, okay? But again, this is what we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is what we see in the letters of Paul. The thing changes dramatically when we have a different attitude. And for us, and also for our meetings that are dealing with all the texts in the New Testament, is exactly to understand when we had this shift between a criticism from within the family and a criticism that became from outside of the family. Because, I mean, for instance, now we have a lot of discussion about the Gospel of John. We will not be dealing with the Gospel of John in these 3 days, but I understand. I mean, a lot of colleagues have problems, okay, because of this. And then when can we say that the text is now changing perspective, is no longer speaking from inside the family? I mean, these are important questions.
So go ahead, Mark. Yes.
May I come back in? I'd like to come in with back to what Jason commented on. I'm not suggesting that they're the same as Paul. What I think they're different. They're the extreme. Maybe they're the exception that proves the rule. They are bigger jerks than Paul is about how they feel about their fellow sibling who has done something that's made mom and dad mad. And there's jerks out there. And they're bigger ones, but I don't think that they should be the standard by which we measure and decide that Paul has to be. Paul actually argues otherwise, at least as I've been trying to understand him and retranslate him and figure out what his arguments are really designed for, which in the case of trying to challenge Gentiles in Christ, that they're not replacing the Jews who don't agree with Paul yet, does seem like it makes sense of someone who's defending the sibling, not throwing them out of the family, unlike the particular case. So any case that we take, we could push it too far. But the point is that Jews can talk about fellow Jews, Israelites about Israelites, and anyone else about anyone else in extreme ways, in certain extreme conditions. And once they get put in paper and made into the Bible and universalized, we do something very different than what was actually taking place.
Thanks for that. We're going to let Giulio speak. I'd like also to maybe address two more questions after that. One is from the chat feature. There has been a lot of interesting feed, and I apologize that I'm not able to follow everything that's going on there in that parallel universe, so to speak. But Bernadette Bruden has been raising some interesting questions. Maybe I'll read just one of them because it's addressed to the panelists. The Paul within Judaism discussion appears to me to focus mainly on halachic matters and on apocalyptic, whereas the Paul in politics discussion focus mainly on Jews or Judeans in relation to Roman rule. Whereas today, Jews usually divide along halachic lines. For example, Reform Jews drive on the Sabbath and modern Orthodox Jews do not or could not, although Zionism and responses, sorry, I lost my thread here. Although Zionism and responses to Israeli politics and military actions have increasingly become an additional axis. As ancient source documents, Jesus was not the only Jewish Messiah. Can the panelists address how you fit the category of Messiah along with varying Jewish responses to Roman rule, another ancient axis of separation among Jews? So maybe the panelists can think about that while Giulio shares some comments.
Isaac, will you just read the last sentence of it? The actual just question part?
I'm sorry. Another axis of separation among Jews into the question of Paul within Judaism. Excuse me. Yeah. So I think the question is basically how do the panelists figure Paul's relationship to the Roman Empire within this discussion about within Judaism when we have other competing messiahs? Did this play a factor in how we conceive of Paul's Jewishness? The question is in the chat feature for the panelists to observe. Giulio.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for other panelists. I wanted to ask that is also a reflection for everyone. As Jason said before, we didn't presuppose a boundary. How much longer can we, into the within Judaism perspective, continue to analyze Paul's thought in terms of boundaries or identity? And to what extent can we instead move forward freely, focuses on his originality and newness? Might it be more helpful to think in terms of before and after without discontinuity, of course, since for Paul the only possible way of being was to be Jewish, rather than in terms of inside, within, and outside. Paul is in fact living in a new time between already and not yet. So perhaps certain ethnic or ritual categories undergo a deep transformation precisely because this is a new situation. And I think this is a better or a new point of view about Paul thought.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I don't know if the panelists want to respond to Giulio's comment or to the question that was raised by Bernadette Bruden. I mean, could this have been like the messiahship of Jesus, one of the sticking points? Would other Jews in the diaspora, for example, be like, hey, we don't want to have any trouble with this Jew here, Paul, preaching about this Messiah who, got crucified by the Roman authorities? And Bernadette Bruden is actually here with us now to join. Mark, would you like to respond first to that question? And then Bernadette can also do a follow-up.
Sure. I just briefly, I'm sorry to be coming in so much. I'll try to back off. But I think Paula and others have made the case that many people could make claims about messiahs. That's fine. That's a theoretical argument. But what the issue is when you change social behavior in groups along a line that is established. Again, I think the Catholic thing, this person could out Catholic all the Catholics, but they're not entitled to the sacraments unless they become a Catholic. And if somebody said that they were and actually enacted it, it would create a major disruption, and there would be all kinds of consequences of this and a split eventually. So I think we need to, if we're going to talk about messianic stuff, the usefulness, we need to talk about what is at issue. And as I said in Galatians, I think he's saying that they don't want to answer, in this case, to the local and the Roman authorities for something that the Jewish community is exempted from, but other people aren't exempted from, unless they actually also become Jewish too. Some sort of inner politics is going on, and they just want to conform with the current policies on that. And this Messiah claim is what these non-Jews and Paul and other Jews who think this are using as the legitimation, the justification by faithfulness to this Messiah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Bernadette, Rudin, since you're with us, I don't know if you want to vocalize anything that you said in writing in the chat feature. Please feel free to do so.
Thank you so much. This is just wonderful. I observe or perceive that everyone here, and probably most of the audience members, are concerned about preventing anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in the world today, in a post-Shoah world, and that we are using that in our research, we are attempting to be responsible to those concerns. And one current way in which anti-Semitism is at issue is with the question of Jewish Zionists and Jewish non-Zionists and criticism of Israel. And so that was the background of my asking the question about the political category of Messiah. But also, I listed, if people want to look at it, we have a current anti-Semitism bill before the U.S. Congress, and conservative Christian Republicans have added a clause to it that their free exercise of religion will not be infringed upon, by which they explicitly mean they should be allowed to teach that the Jews killed Christ in accordance with the Bible. So we have been talking about one of those passages, 1 Thessalonians 2:15 here. And in order for our work to address anti-Semitism in the current world, I would love to hear from the panelists how you would like for your how can your scholarship contribute to contemporary discussions, both in law and in university policy, which exists not only in the US, but also in Europe, where the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism that defines much criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic is playing a role in university policy with respect to invitations and disinvitations and so forth. And and that Kenneth Stern, one of the main authors of that definition, has vigorously argued should not ever be made into university policy because it infringes upon free speech, freedom of expression. So, in other words, the Shoah is part of what we're dealing with, but we are now dealing with new questions concerning anti-Semitism in which biblical interpretation is central. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberta. I mean, those are huge questions that, I tried to bring that up a bit in my introduction, around the question of supersessionism. Definitely essential points. My take on this has evolved over time. Academia in general is just in big trouble, all the more so now. As somebody who was tenured and lost tenure and I lost my position here, not from my doing, it's just budgetary cuts. I think many of us feel even more vulnerable to address these controversial issues because tenure has come to mean nothing, regardless of where we stand on these matters. And I remember trying to address some of these questions, feeling some kind of confidence that I could speak to a certain extent about these in an informed, sensitive manner. And then suddenly I lost my tenure here at my institution. Thankfully, my situation seems to be rectified or is being rectified. But that personal experience, I think, speaks also to a broader trend that is disturbing across academia before October 7 even, but even all the more so after October 7, the state of higher education and to what extent we as academics have the power to even speak or voice our opinions, right, about these matters. I think some of us would rather find refuge in the ancient world and just stay there. But it's a different reality. Academia is under much more higher scrutiny, especially in these United States of America, where we can't stay in that comfort zone. And we have to think and reflect on these opinions. My own hermeneutic, and I'll just end on that point and allow some others here to maybe speak as time is already over. Right at the end, it's getting really exciting here. Is that and I've said it before, if Paul is a supersessionist, then so be it. And I say it as a historian of religion, first of all. I just have to encounter that sober reality, whatever text it may be. This is my personal hermeneutic. What we do with that afterwards is the question, right? That doesn't mean we are going to, reinforce that supersessionism or embrace it in the manner that it was a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So I think that the historian just has to accept the text for what it is. What we then do with it from an ethical point of view, theological point of view is another question, but definitely matters that whether we're invested in those enterprises or not, we have to be mindful of because our information is available there to the public. This is being aired live, which maybe makes even some of us more anxious about making any pronouncements on this matter. But I don't want to have the final word on this very important question. I don't know if anybody else would like to chime in. This is your moment to shine.
As a thriving adjunct, I'll just echo the feeling of tenuousness here, as someone who's never had the opportunity to even think of tenure. But the other thing I'll point out is that nobody listens to us anyway. They're just they're just plugging stuff into LLMs and getting the answers from Grok and ChatGPT as it is. So I'm not sure that it really matters anymore what we have to say, except in as much as it gets fed into whatever people are consuming from that slop.
Well, thanks for that. And maybe as a thriving adjunct, you'll feel more empowered and bold to speak openly than some of us that are in the system. Janelle, yes.
Okay, well, I'm also a thriving adjunct, and then I did grow up Catholic in a multi-faith family. So there are Jews and there are evangelical Christians and there are Mormons or Latter-day Saints. So we have a good sampling. And that was part of the reason that I wanted to go into biblical scholarship because there is a bit of going back and finding common ground. However, in terms of just thinking of the university, I do teach at a Catholic university, and some of my students are interested in going into church settings. And as someone who has been a practicing Catholic, I did have to attend baptism classes for my nephew, at which anti-Semitism was specifically brought up because, of course, with the history of baptism in the Catholic Church, sometimes Jews were baptized when they shouldn't have been. So this was mentioned in our baptism training as I was a godmother. And I would want some aspect of anti-Semitism in our biblical scholarship regardless, because, Sometimes in your classes, you are going to have that intersection with practice, and it would be good to think about it just in terms of like the hegemony that exists now, and then also the hegemony that existed then, because in order to reclaim Judea or Israel from the Romans, one obviously has to show that there are sufficient people and political will to take it over. So I think that all of our conversations in the past are going to be a little ambiguous as well.
Thank you for that, Janelle. I'm going to let Gabriele have the final word and wrap up this session because we are well over time.
Exactly. Let me say just a word on this, taking advantage of the fact of my position as the director of Enoch Seminar, and also because I have nothing to lose now at the end of my career. So, of course, we are all aware that our job as scholars has implications also on the contemporary life of churches and on the political life, always. I mean, this is not nothing new. I mean, scholars have influenced the political and religious life. And so what you said is just a reminder that we must be aware of what we are doing. On the other hand, we are trying to do it honestly. I mean, like Isaac was saying, I mean, we cannot change history because this should be better for contemporary issues, okay? If we discover that our fathers and mothers hated each other very much, it doesn't mean that we have to do the same, okay? So, on the other hand, many things that we are emphasizing, like the diversity of Jewish thought in the Second Temple period, the fact that Christianity was born within Judaism, the fact that it was essentially a quarrel within the family of Israel at the beginning, at least, that's had important ramifications in the theological discourse and also in political discourse. I can assure you that as Enoch Seminar, we will continue to have a conversation about these matters, of course, also in the ways and the forms that we think are the most appropriate. Okay, but I think that we are all very aware of what we said and of the implications of our work. I mean, even when we talk of ancient times and ancient things, we are still thinking of things that have significance, have an impact for contemporary times. So let me conclude just this session expressing my satisfaction for this very long and lively discussion that, as usual, became lively and lively over time. We will have the opportunity to continue this conversation tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Paula Fredriksson will join us, and I invite all the panelists to be with us for an informal conversation.
One moment.
About the result of our discussion.
It's at 8 o'clock. It's 9:30 a.m. Eastern time. Eastern time.
9.
Yes.
So I'm in Italy. For me, it will be
Yeah.
so I'm a little bit confused by the time. Okay, so it's 9:30 tomorrow morning. New York Times. Okay. So we will start at 9:30. The first 30 minutes will be devoted to an informal discussion with Paula Fredriksson and others and some of the panelists that want to join us about a general reaction to what was said what we said today. And then we'll have a second session on the Gospel of Mark that I expect will be as lively as this one. So I thank you, all of you really, for your contribution, for your eagerness to be involved in this discussion. Of course, this is not the end of our discussion on Paul or on the within Judaism perspective, but certainly today has been an important step forward. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.